Leave your fear on the porch and get inside, huh? She said it to 6 men who looked like they could break her door off its hinges with one hand. 6 snow-buried strangers with leather cuts, frost-cracked lips, and eyes like they hadn't slept in 2 days. Martha Calloway was 73 years old, 5'2", and standing alone in a farmhouse that the bank was already circling. And she opened her door anyway. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The foreclosure notice had been sitting on Martha Calloway's kitchen table for 6 hours before she finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. She had moved it twice, once under a stack of old utility bills, once beneath the church bulletin from the previous Sunday, as if paper could disappear simply by being buried. But it couldn't. It kept pulling her eyes back across the room, the way a bad tooth pulls your tongue, over and over, no matter how many times you tell yourself to stop. The notice was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper with the county seal embossed in the upper left corner and the letterhead of Rolston Development Group running beneath it in clean, serious black ink. The language was formal and cold, the kind of language designed to sound inevitable, to make a person feel that the outcome had already been decided long before the letter arrived. It informed Martha Jean Calloway, owner of record, that delinquent property taxes in the amount of $9,412, plus accumulated penalties and administrative fees, were now past due. It further informed her that failure to satisfy the full balance by noon on Friday, February the 18th, would result in the transfer of property title to Rolston Development Group, which had acquired the outstanding tax lien under Montana State Statute 42-17. Noon on Friday. It was Thursday evening. The blizzard had already been hammering Silver Creek for 4 hours. Martha stood at her kitchen window and watched the snow come down sideways. The yard light she had kept burning since Walter died, the one he had wired himself off the back barn, was barely visible through the wall of white. Everything beyond 20 feet had simply ceased to exist. The mountain road that connected her property to the county highway had probably been impassable since mid-afternoon. The temperature was dropping toward -14. The weatherman on the billing station had called it the worst February storm in 11 years. She turned away from the window and looked at the letter again. $9,412. She had $463 in her checking account. She had a jar with $87 in cash inside the cabinet above the refrigerator, left over from last month's grocery savings. She had Walter's old pocket watch, which a man at the antique mall in Billings had once offered her $200 for. She had the farmhouse itself, and the 42 acres around it, and the workshop out back that still smelled like pine shavings and motor oil and the particular brand of soap Walter had used every morning for 38 years. She had none of the things that the letter wanted. Martha sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands the way her mother had taught her to do when she needed to think clearly without letting panic move her feet before her mind was ready. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had worked her whole life knuckled and spotted. The right index finger, slightly crooked, here, where she had broken it, pulling a calf loose from a fence post in 1987, and they steadied her now the way they always had, simply by being familiar and real in hers. She thought about Walter. He had built this house himself in the summer of 1974, the first summer after their wedding, with lumber he had milled from timber on the northeast corner of the property. He had poured the foundation by hand with his brother Carl, who was gone now too, and he had framed every wall and run every wire and plumbed every pipe before he brought her here. He had been 27 years old and so proud of what he had made that he had stood in the front yard on the day they moved in and just looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Martha had watched him from the porch, holding a box of kitchen things, and she had thought, this man is going to be all right. We are going to be all right. She had been right for 41 years. She was less certain now. The wind hit the north wall of the house with a sound like someone throwing gravel at the siding. And Martha flinched despite herself. The lights flickered. She had candles ready on the counter, 3 of them, with a box of long kitchen matches, and the wood stove in the living room was loaded and burning steady. She had 2 gallons of drinking water in jugs beside the back door. She had done this enough times to know how to be ready. What she did not know was what she was going to do about the letter. She thought about calling her daughter, Patricia, down in Bozeman. But Patricia had her own bills and her own troubles, and she had already offered twice to send money that Martha had refused because she knew it would mean Patricia going without. She thought about calling the county assessor's office, but they were the ones who had sent the letter or who had allowed the situation that led to the letter, and she doubted very much that they were taking calls on a Thursday night with a blizzard closing in. She thought about calling Dean Rolston directly because she had his number somewhere. He had sent a man out to the farm the previous spring with a glossy brochure and an offer she had found offensive in its politeness, and asking him exactly what kind of man does this to an elderly widow in February. But she already knew what kind of man does this. She had lived long enough to recognize the breed. The ones who dressed up greed in the language of business. The ones who used paperwork and deadlines and legal fees as weapons, because those weapons left no visible bruises. The ones who picked their targets carefully, the tired, the isolated, the proud, because the tired and the isolated and the proud were the ones least likely to ask for help. Martha stood up from the table and went to the wood stove and opened the damper a little more. The fire responded with a low, satisfied roar, and the warmth pushed back against the cold that was seeping through the old windows. She would not sleep much tonight. She knew that already. She went to the cabinet and got down the jar with the $87 in it and set it on the table next to the foreclosure notice and looked at the 2 things side by side for a long moment. Then she put the jar back. Then she sat back down. Then the pounding started. It was not a knock. It was the sound of a fist hitting her front door with urgent, desperate force, the kind of pounding that does not care about politeness or introduction. That comes only from a person who is genuinely afraid of what will happen if the door does not open. Martha was on her feet before the second round of blows landed, her heart slamming against her sternum, and she grabbed the fireplace poker from the stand beside the wood stove because that was what Walter had always told her to do if someone came to the door at night that she wasn't expecting. She went to the front hall and stood on her side of the door and said, in her firmest voice, the one she had developed over 40 years of managing stubborn cattle and more stubborn men, "Who's there?" The answer came back muffled through the door, deep and rough and almost swallowed by the wind. "Ma'am, please. We're freezing out here. Our bikes went down on the mountain road. We got a man who's hurt. Please." Martha's hand tightened on the poker. She thought about everything she knew about the situation. A blizzard, minus 14 degrees, a man saying he was hurt. The pounding had stopped, and what she heard now instead was the wind. And beneath the wind, what she thought might be voices, more than one. Trying to stay calm, telling each other to be patient. She leaned close to the door and said, "How many of you?" 6. "Ma'am, we're from the Montana chapter. We're bikers. I won't lie to you, but we are not going to hurt you. We just need to get out of the cold. Bikers." She stood in her front hall with the poker in her hand and thought about that word and what it meant to her and what it actually should mean to her, which were 2 different things, and she was aware of both simultaneously. She was also aware of minus 14 degrees and a man who was hurt and the particular quality of desperation in that voice, which was not the voice of a person planning to harm her. She had heard desperate voices in her life, and she knew the difference. She thought about Walter, who had once brought home a hitchhiker during a rainstorm, without asking her first, because the man was soaking wet and had no shoes, and Walter could not drive past a person in that condition. She had been furious for about 10 minutes. Then she had made the man soup. She thought about what it means to be a decent person, when decency costs you something. Then she turned the deadbolt and the chain latch, and she opened her front door. There were 6 of them, covered in snow from their shoulders to their boots, their leather cuts visible, only because they were a slightly different shade of frozen than everything else. The one closest to the door, enormous, broad-shouldered, with a blonde-gray beard full of ice crystals and eyes the color of Winter Creek water, was holding his left arm close to his body in a way that told Martha immediately that something was wrong with the shoulder. The others ranged behind him, 5 men in various states of cold and exhaustion, all of them looking at her with expressions that could only be read as pleas. "Bear," the big man said, pointing to himself with his good arm. "Logan Maddox, road captain. I'm sorry to do this to you." "Ma'am, we had no other choice." Martha looked at them. She looked at their blue lips and their shaking hands and the way the youngest one, who could not have been much older than 30, was swaying slightly on his feet like a man on a ship deck. She looked at the snow driving in past them and felt it on her face, sharp and wet and mean. She stepped back from the door. "Leave your fear on the porch and get inside," she said. They came in. The heat from the wood stove hit them the second they crossed the threshold, and several of the men made involuntary sounds, half gasps, half groans that Martha recognized as the sound of a body remembering that warmth was a thing that existed. She pointed toward the living room and said, "Go stand by the stove. Don't crowd it, take turns getting close." She had already started moving toward the hall closet where she kept the extra blankets and Walter's old winter things. Bear stepped into the light of the living room, and she got a better look at him. He was maybe 55, maybe 60, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard and survived. The beard and the hair both ran together into something that made him look like a Viking who had wandered into the wrong century. His left arm was hanging wrong, not broken, she thought, but the shoulder had been either pulled out or badly jammed. He was trying not to show pain. She could see exactly how hard he was trying. "That shoulder needs attention," she said. "It can wait," he said. "I wasn't asking," she said. He looked at her for a second, as if recalibrating something in his mind, and then something in his face settled, and he said, "Yes, ma'am. Sit down at the table. Not the kitchen chair, the wood one by the window. The arms are lower, and it'll be easier to work on you there." He sat. She brought the blankets out first and distributed them to the other 5 men who had arranged themselves around the wood stove with the quiet, cooperative efficiency of people who knew how to work together under difficult circumstances. She noted that they did not shove or argue or grab. They stepped aside for each other. The youngest one was still shaking pretty badly, and an older rider, gray-bearded, quiet, with a tattoo of a compass rose on his left hand, put one of the extra blankets around the young man's shoulders without being asked. She went to her bathroom and got the first aid kit and the bottle of ibuprofen and the heat packs she kept in the drawer for her arthritis. And she came back to the living room and stood over there. "And I'm going to touch your arm now. You tell me when it hurts worse." "It hurts at a consistent worse." "Ma'am, Martha," she said. "My name is Martha." "Martha," he said. She worked his jacket off his left arm carefully, because the shoulder would not tolerate much rotation. He did not make a sound, but his jaw tightened in a way that told her exactly what she needed to know. The joint was not fully dislocated. If it had been, he would not have made it up her front steps, but it had been severely wrenched, probably when the motorcycle went down on the ice. "You're going to need a real doctor when the road clears," she said. "I know it," he said. "Tonight I can give you heat and support in these." She shook 2 ibuprofen into her palm and held them out. "And you'll keep that arm as still as you can." He took the pills. She brought him a glass of water. She got the heat packs from the bathroom drawer and showed him where to hold them against the joint. "You've done this before," he said. It was not quite a question. 42 years on a cattle ranch," she said. "I've set things that were worse than that shoulder and had less to work with." Something in his expression shifted, a small, real change, like a door opening just enough to let the light in. "Your husband's place?" "My place now," she said. "My husband built it. He passed 8 years ago." "I'm sorry," Bear said. And she heard in those 2 words that he meant it, the way people mean things when they have also lost someone. The specific gravity of it. "So am I," she said. Then she stood up and went to the kitchen. Because there were 6 men in her living room who needed food, and she was not the kind of woman who stood still when there was something practical to be done. She went through what she had. The pantry inventory was not impressive. It was the kind of pantry that a woman who has been stretching a fixed income through a Montana winter keeps. There were 3 large potatoes, a can of beef and 2 cans of mixed vegetables, a half bag of dried lentils, a jar of preserved tomatoes she had put up in September, some onions, dried herbs, chicken stock from the cubes in the drawer. She had flour and baking powder and a small amount of butter for biscuits. She had planned this food to last her 12 more days. She put the pot on the stove. She did not calculate or deliberate about this. There were people who were cold and hungry, and there was food. The calculation had already been made by something older and simpler than reasoning. The stew came together slowly, and as it did, the men in the living room thawed literally and figuratively. She could hear them begin to talk, low at first, then in something closer to their natural register. She heard the crack of a laugh from somewhere, and it surprised her pleasantly. She heard Bear's voice, asking about road conditions, about which way the wind had been running when they went down, about the bike status. He was working even while he was injured, keeping track of his people, asking the questions that needed to be asked. She went to the living room doorway. "The phones aren't working," she said. "No signal in this weather. But I have a landline and it was working an hour ago if anyone needs to call." 5 heads turned toward her. The older one with the compass rose tattoo said, "You serious? Ma'am? There's a phone on the wall in the kitchen. Help yourself." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. She heard him trying the line, heard him say a number into the receiver, heard him leave a short message for someone's wife, probably from the tone, and hang up. He came back to the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Thank you," he said. "That was my wife would have been up all night." "I know," Martha said. "Use it for whoever needs it." 3 of them used the phone. Bear did not, which made her think that either there was nobody to call or that he had not yet accepted that the situation was as serious as it was. The stew was ready at 9:15. She carried the pot to the table and got down every bowl. She owned 6 regular bowls that she pressed into service, and she ladled it out and brought the biscuits from the oven and set them in a cloth-lined basket at the center of the table. The men sat down, all of them, 6 large, road-worn men at her kitchen table, filling every chair and making the room feel half its size and twice as warm. They had removed their outer jackets, and the leather cuts were visible now, and she could see the patches on the backs, the skull, the wings, the name. She had seen those patches on television and had formed whatever impressions television creates. She was already revising. They waited for her to sit before anyone reached for a spoon. She noticed that Bear, sitting at the far end of the table with his heat pack taped against his shoulder and his good arm free, said, "Martha, would it be all right? We'd like to say grace, if that suits you." She had not expected that. "Of course," she said. The man with the compass rose tattoo bowed his head and said, "Very simply, Lord, thank this woman for the warmth of food and the open door. Keep us humble enough to remember who we are when someone like her shows us." Amen. 6 voices, including Bear, said amen. Martha said it too. They ate, and eating broke something loose that had been wound tight in the room since the moment they arrived, the awkwardness that comes from strangers in unfamiliar territory, the careful watchfulness on both sides. The stew was good. She knew it was good because she had been making it since before most of these men were born, and because 4 of them had second helpings, and the young one had thirds, and because nobody talked for the first several minutes, which is the truest compliment food can receive. Then they began to talk. She learned names. Bear she already had. The compass rose man was Dennis, 53, a diesel mechanic from Kalispell. The youngest one, still a little pale, but steadier now, was called Rabbit, and his actual name was Ryan. And he was 28 years old and had been riding with the chapter for 3 years. Across from him sat Marcus, who was Black American and enormous and very quiet, and who turned out, when he did speak, to have the driest sense of humor she had encountered in some time. Then there was Pete with the white blonde hair and the busted lower lip from going down on the asphalt, and Garza, the smallest man at the table, who was Mexican-American and said almost nothing during dinner but kept refilling everyone's water glasses without being asked, which Martha found enormously admirable. They learned things about her too, though she gave them less than they gave her, which was habit. She mentioned Silver Creek, the ranch, the 42 acres. She did not mention the letter, but the letter was still on the table. She had forgotten to move it. And sometime, during the second helping of stew, she saw Dennis's eyes travel across the kitchen and land on the cream-colored paper with the county seal and the Rolston Development Group letterhead. And she saw his face change in a way she could not entirely interpret. He did not say anything. Not then. After dinner, 3 of the men helped her clear the table without being asked. Rabbit washed the dishes. Dennis dried them with the towel she kept hung on the stove handle. Garza swept the kitchen floor with the broom she kept in the back corner, which she had not even shown him, which meant he had noticed it on his way to the table. She stood in the doorway and watched them and thought, these are not what I expected, which was precisely when she should have known that the night was not over in its revelations. It was Bear who finally said something about the letter. He had been quiet through the cleanup, leaning in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen with his arm immobilized and his eyes moving across the room in the slow, methodical way of a person who is seeing everything and processing most of it. When the others had filed back to the living room and it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, he said, that foreclosure notice, that's Rolston's group. Martha looked at him. You know that name? We know that name, he said. And the way he said it was flat and certain and carried a quality she had only heard in voices that had arrived at the end of a long reckoning. Where did you go wrong with the taxes? I didn't go wrong, she said. And she heard the edge in her own voice and did not apologize for it. I paid what I was told to pay. Then a letter came saying I owed more. Then another. Then this. Bear said nothing. He was looking at the letter from across the room. The amount keeps changing, she said, and she heard, to her own dismay, that her voice had cracked slightly on the word changing, which she had not intended. It was 4,000 2 years ago. Now, it's nearly 10,000 with fees. I've never been able to get anyone to explain to my satisfaction. Bear turned to look at her. Can I see it? She brought it to him. He read it with the deliberate focus of someone who was looking for specific things and finding some of them, and his jaw tightened the way it had when she was working on his shoulder. Then he set the letter down on the kitchen table and said, Martha, do you have a phone charger I can borrow? I need a few minutes and whatever signal I can get. Top drawer beside the sink, she said. There's a charger in there from my granddaughter's last visit. It might work. He found the charger. He plugged in his phone. He stood at the kitchen counter and watched the screen and tried twice before he got a signal thin and unreliable, barely enough, and he stepped just slightly closer to the window and held very still, like a man trying not to startle a skittish animal. Martha pretended to be interested in the jar she was washing. She heard him typing, not a call, a message. She heard the small sound of it sending. He put the phone back on the charger and turned around. And he looked at her with the Winter Creek eyes and said, my chapter's attorney is a woman named Evelyn Shaw. She's very good. She's going to look at this in the morning. I didn't ask for, Martha began. No, he said, you didn't. But you opened your door. Martha, you don't get to close it on help when it comes back around. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She turned back to the jar she was washing and scrubbed it with more force than was strictly necessary. You're a stubborn woman, Bear said, and she could hear the half-smile in it. I've heard that, she said. It's a compliment, he said. She didn't answer, but she set the jar down a little more gently. Outside, the blizzard peaked sometime around midnight, rattling the north-facing windows in their frames and driving snow under the barn door and building drift diffs against the fence line that would take half of March to melt. Martha had made up the couch and the extra bedroom and laid out sleeping bags on the living room floor, and the men settled into them with the practiced ability of people who had slept in worse places. She did not sleep. She sat in her chair by the wood stove with her hands in her lap and the foreclosure notice ends on the table, 10 feet away, and she listened to the storm and to the unfamiliar sound of breathing that was not her own in her house. And she thought about tomorrow. Noon tomorrow. $9,412 and a developer with lawyers who knew how to use paperwork as a wrecking ball. She thought about the spring on the back 40 that had been providing water to 3 neighboring ranches through a shared agreement Walter had made in 1981. She thought about the East Meadow and the way it looked in July when the grass came up past her knees. She thought about the window in the kitchen that Walter had framed slightly crooked, an eighth of an inch off plumb, and how she had given him grief about it for a year before she realized she had stopped noticing it because she had stopped wanting it to be any different. This was not just property. This was the physical record of everything she had built with a man she had loved for 41 years. And someone's trying to take it from her with a piece of paper and a deadline. She looked at the sleeping men. Dennis, on the far end of the living room floor, had his arm thrown over his eyes. Rabbit was curled with the extra blanket pulled up to his chin. Looking in sleep, approximately 16 years old, Marcus was flat on his back with his hands folded on his chest like a deacon at rest. Garza was barely visible under his sleeping bag, just a pair of socks sticking out. Pete's split lip had closed up and he'd color in the morning. And Bear, on the couch, was not asleep. He was lying still, but his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and when she looked at him, he turned his head and looked back at her without embarrassment. 2 people awake in the middle of the night with things on their minds. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you," she said. "Shoulder," he said. "House," she said. He nodded once, slowly. Then he said, "Martha, we will not let this happen." She looked at him for a long moment. She had been getting by on her own for 8 years. She had learned to distrust easy promises the way you learn to distrust easy, weather the fast sunshine that comes right before the real storm. She had heard that sentence, or sentences like it, from people who meant well and then ran up against how much it actually cost to mean well and drifted away. But there was something in the way he said it that was different from that, something certain without being loud. The way you talk when you are stating geography, not making a promise, this is north, this is the river, this is what is true. She did not say she believed him. She did not say she didn't. She said, "Get some sleep, Bear. Your shoulder needs it." He almost smiled. He turned back to the ceiling. After a while, his breathing changed. Martha sat in her chair until an hour before dawn. When she finally got up and built the fire back up and started the coffee, because the men would need it when they woke, and because she had made up her mind that whatever was coming, she would face it on her feet and with something warm in her hands. She was at the counter, measuring out the flour for biscuits when she heard the first engine outside. Then another. She looked out the window. The storm had broken. The sky was still dark, but clearing from the west, and the yard light cut through and lit the snow. And in that light, she could see the road, the county road, the one that connected the mountain pass to the highway, and it was empty. Just snow and silence and the pale, hard first edge of morning. She went back to her biscuits. She did not know yet. As she worked the dough with her hands in the pre-dawn kitchen with 6 sleeping bikers and a foreclosure notice and 42 years of her life, all in the same small space, that Bear's message had already been received. She did not know that her phone, on the charger in the bedroom, had no fewer than 17 messages waiting for it from numbers she did not recognize. She did not know that across Silver Creek and down into the valley and out to 4 neighboring chapters, men and women had been waking up in the dark to a single message sent on a thin signal through a February blizzard. She did not know any of that yet. She knew that there were biscuits to make and coffee to brew and a day to face. She put the pan in the oven and set her timer and stood in her kitchen in the dark and the warmth and said, very quietly, to no one who was awake to hear her, "All right, Walter, let's see what happens next." The biscuits came out of the oven at 6:42 in the morning, and the smell of them moving through the house was the thing that woke everyone up. Martha heard it happen, the shift in the quality of the silence. The rustle of sleeping bags, a low groan that she recognized as Marcus, adjusting his considerable frame from the floor to something approximating vertical. Then Rabbit's voice, still half asleep and entirely sincere. Is someone actually making biscuits right now? Dennis said. From somewhere near the wood stove, son. Stop talking and go find out. Martha had the coffee poured into every mug she owned by the time they filed into the kitchen, rumpled, creased with sleep, still wearing Walter's old wool socks that she had distributed the night before because 4 of them had come in with wet boots. They looked different in the morning, less enormous, more human. Rabbit had a crease mark from the sleeping bag zipper running the full length of his left cheek, and he was rubbing at it self-consciously. Garza had his hair pushed up on one side in a way that defied explanation. Marcus came in last, ducking slightly out of long habit under a door frame that was actually tall enough to clear him by 2 inches, and looked at the biscuits on the counter and said, very quietly and very seriously, Martha, I want you to know that wherever you go when this life is over, I believe it is going to be somewhere very good. Sit down, she said, all of you. Bear was last out of the living room, moving carefully, with his arm held close, and she could see from the way he carried himself that the night had not been kind to the shoulder. He had slept eventually. She had heard his breathing change, sometime around 3, but sleep on a shoulder that badly wrenched was not the restorative kind. He settled into the chair at the end of the table and accepted coffee with his good hand, and looked at her with the focused, measuring look she was coming to recognize as simply the way he processed things. How bad? She asked, nodding at the shoulder. Manageable, he said. That's not what I asked. It's what I've got for, he said, with the ghost of something that might have been humor. She set a biscuit in front of him and said, eat that. It'll make you honest. He looked at the biscuit. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she could not quite name. It was not amusement. Exactly. And it was not surprise. Exactly. It was closer to the expression of a man who has been navigating a difficult road for a long time and has just found an unexpected mile marker that confirms he is not lost. He picked up the biscuit with his good hand. They ate. The kitchen was full, in a way it had not been full since Patricia's last visit 3 Christmases ago, and Martha was aware of that fullness the way you are aware of a sound returning that you had stopped noticing was missing all at once, with a kind of ache underneath the warmth. It was Rabbit who noticed first. He was sitting closest to the counter, and he had leaned back in his chair after his second biscuit in the unconscious way of a young person who has eaten well and feels physically safe, and his eyes had traveled around the kitchen, the way young eyes do when they are not focused on anything in particular and are simply taking in the world. Martha saw the exact moment his gaze landed on the two buckets she had set beneath the drip in the corner of the kitchen ceiling, the one above the cabinet where the roof had been slowly failing for the better part of 2 winters. The buckets were empty now because it was frozen, but they were there and they were obvious, and Rabbit looked at them and then looked at the water stain, spreading across the ceiling above them, brown and wide and very definitely not new. He said nothing, but he sat forward in his chair. Dennis had seen it too. And Pete, who despite the split lip was sharp-eyed and quiet in a way that Martha suspected was professional habit, he had mentioned briefly the night before something about 15 years in general contracting. Pete was now looking at the ceiling and then at the wall behind the stove and then at the window frame on the north side where the caulk had cracked years ago and the cold had been getting through in a way that Martha had learned to offset by keeping a thick curtain over it. She noticed them noticing. She was not embarrassed. She was something that was the close neighbor of embarrassed, but was actually closer to tired, the particular tiredness of a person who has been managing deterioration alone for long enough that the deterioration has started to feel like a normal condition of life. The roof has been on my list, she said preemptively, in the tone of someone closing a door. How long? Pete asked. 2 winters, she said. Pete nodded once slowly and looked at Dennis, and something passed between them without words, in the way it does between people who have worked alongside each other long enough that language has become optional. She refilled the coffee mugs and changed the subject. She asked about the motorcycle that had gone down hardest, Bear's. She assumed, given the shoulder, and the conversation moved toward practical things: road conditions, the snowplow schedule, the likelihood of the county highway being cleared to one lane by mid-morning. These were subjects that everyone at the table had opinions about and that carried the conversation away from leaking roofs and foreclosure notices and all the things that Martha did not want to need help with. But the foreclosure notice was still on the kitchen table. She had meant to put it away before they woke up. She had simply forgotten, in the business of biscuits and coffee, and now it was sitting there in plain view, and several pairs of eyes had already found it. She reached across and picked it up and turned toward the counter as if she needed to set it somewhere, but Bear's voice caught her before she got there. "Martha," he said, "sit down." It was not an order. It was not even a request. Exactly. It was the tone of a person who has something to say and is asking for the space to say it with the weight of something serious behind the asking. She sat. Bear put down his coffee mug. He looked around the table once, a brief, comprehensive look that landed on each man in turn and seemed to carry some kind of communication, because the room got quieter in a way that was not about volume so much as attention. "We heard the number last night," he said to Martha. $9,412. "You weren't supposed to hear that," she said. "We hear what we hear," Bear said. "And what I want to tell you is that number is wrong." Martha looked at him. "Wrong how?" "I got 3 bars of signal last night for about 4 minutes, he said. "I sent that notice to Evelyn, our attorney, and I got a text back from her at 5 this morning. She didn't say much. She said enough." He leaned forward against the table, good arm braced. "That number has additions in it that should not be there." Evelyn used the word manufactured. The kitchen went very still. "Manufactured," Martha repeated. "She's going to need to see the original documents. The full file, if you have it. Every piece of paper that came before this one." Bear kept his voice level and factual, but his eyes were steady on her with an intensity that made the word manufactured sit in the air between them like a lit fuse. "Do you have that?" Martha thought of Walter's workshop. The filing cabinet in the back corner, the old green metal one that he had bought second-hand from the county surplus auction in 1989, and that she had always complained was ugly and that she had never once moved or emptied. Walter had filed everything. Every bill, every receipt, every letter, every survey, every county notice going back to 1974. She had not opened that cabinet in 8 years. "I have it," she said. Dennis, across the table, exhaled slowly. It was not a sigh of relief so much as the sound of a man who has been holding himself ready for bad news and has received something that is not quite bad news. "Not yet." "Good," he said. "That's good." "I want to be clear about something," Martha said. And she said it the way she said things when she needed to be heard, precisely and not approximately. "I am not a woman who takes charity. I did not let you in last night because I wanted something from you. I let you in because it was the right thing to do, and that is all." "We know that," Bear said. "Then I need you to know that whatever Evelyn finds, whatever she thinks she can do, that is not why I helped you." "We know that too," he said. "I just needed to say it." "I understand," Bear said. "But Martha, here is something you should understand. We are not offering you charity. We are offering you what anyone deserves when someone else is trying to steal from them. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the table, at the 6 men around it, at the hands wrapped around coffee mugs, scarred hands, working hands, tattooed hands, a hand with a compass rose inked on the back, and she felt something move in her that she had not expected and did not entirely come, because she had learned through long practice that hope was the most expensive thing you could spend on a situation that wasn't resolved yet. But it moved anyway. "All right," she said. "Let me get the file." She put on her coat and her boots and went out the back door to the workshop, and the cold hit her like a wall. The storm had dropped 16 inches, and the path between the house and the workshop was buried. She was 20 steps into it, pushing through snow that was mid-shin on her, when she heard the back door open behind her and looked back to see Dennis and Pete in their boots and jackets falling into step behind her. She didn't argue. Dennis shoveled the path while she went inside, and the workshop was cold enough that her breath came out in clouds. She went to the back corner and opened the green filing cabinet and found the drawer labeled Property County Taxes and pulled it open. And the files inside were neat and tabbed and orderly in Walter's precise handwriting, each year labeled in his careful block letters that she had not seen in 8 years. And that hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force she had not anticipated and did not show. She pulled the most recent years first and then thought better of it and pulled the whole drawer. It came out in a thick stack of folders. Maybe 40 years of documentation, and she carried it back to the house with Pete holding the door, and she set it on the kitchen table, and Bear and Dennis started through it. They worked at it while she cleaned up the breakfast dishes, and while Rabbit and Marcus went out the extra shovels as she kept the barn and started clearing the driveway without asking. She heard them out there, the scrape and thunk of shoveling, the occasional exchange of voices, Rabbit saying something, and Marcus's short, dry reply followed by what was unmistakably laughter. She washed dishes and listened to Bear and Dennis go through Walter's files. At first, the conversation was technical tax bill numbers, lien dates, administrative fee codes, and she only half followed it while she worked. But then Dennis said, in a voice that was carefully controlled in a way that signaled the control was deliberate, "Bear, look at this." The scraping of a chair. A pause. Bear said, "That's not a real fee code." "No," Dennis said. "It is not." Martha turned from the sink. "What did you find?" she said. Dennis looked up at her. He had the reading glasses on. She had not known he wore glasses, had not seen them before, and over the tops of them, his expression was the expression of a man who has found something that confirms a suspicion he had hoped was wrong. The penalty schedule they used to calculate this total, he said, setting one document beside another on the table, does not match the Montana County tax code. These administrative surcharges, these 3 line items here, they don't exist. They're using a code number that doesn't correspond to any actual fee in the county schedule. Someone made them up. The room was very quiet. "Made them up," Martha said flatly. "Added them to inflate the total," Dennis said. He took his glasses off and set them on the table. "Martha, the amount you actually owe the real delinquency, if there is one, is a fraction of what that letter says." She sat down. Not because her legs gave out, she was not that kind of woman, but because sitting was the right thing to do when the ground shifted under you and you needed a moment before you started walking on it again. She sat, and she thought, and then she said why. It was not a question. It was the word you say when the thing you already suspected becomes confirmed, and the why is not a mystery, but a slow, terrible clarification. Bear answered it anyway. "We know Rolston's name," he said. "Not just his name, his method." He set the foreclosure letter and the tax files side by side on the table. There was a man in Browning 2 years ago, disabled veteran. Had a small engine repair shop, been there 23 years. Rolston's group bought an old debt against the building, inflated it with fees that looked legal on paper, and came after the deed. The man didn't know where to start fighting it. He lost the shop. Martha said nothing. "We weren't there for that one," Bear said. "By the time we heard about it, it was done. I have thought about that more times than I want to admit." He said the last sentence quietly, and Martha heard in it what he was not saying, that it had cost him something. The not being there, the arriving too late, the way those things cost people who take responsibility seriously. "And you think this is the same?" she said. "I think this is exactly the same," he said, "with one addition." He tapped the foreclosure letter with one finger. "This is a lot of trouble and a lot of falsified paperwork for a 42-acre cattle property outside a town of 3,000 people. Rolston builds luxury resorts, Martha. He doesn't care about your house. He cares about something on your land." She looked at him. She thought about the spring. The thought about the spring on the back 40 that Walter had surveyed and registered in 1981, the natural spring that fed a creek that ran east through 3 neighboring properties. The spring that the Hendersons and the Kowalski family and old Jim Treadwell had all relied on almost through droughts in 1988 and 2003 and 2012. The spring that Walter had written into a shared use agreement with all 3 families, a document that he had notarized and filed with the county because Walter believed in doing things correctly and in writing and with witnesses. The spring that sat at the northeast corner of her property, right at the edge of where the mountain road cut through, right at the natural entry point to the valley that Ralston wanted to turn into a resort. She felt it click into place, the whole shape of it. "There's a spring," she said, "on the back 40. It feeds the water supply for 3 neighboring properties." Bear was very still. "If someone owned this land," she continued, keeping her voice steady with effort, "they would control that spring. And if they controlled that spring, they could control access to water for everyone on the eastern side of the valley." Dennis had gone completely quiet. He was looking at her over his glasses with an expression that was equal parts admiration and the grim satisfaction of a man watching a puzzle assemble itself. Bear said, "Walter's files. Is there anything in there about the spring?" "Walter filed everything," she said. She went back to the drawer and found the tab that said Water Rights Shared Agreement and pulled the folder and set it on the table. And Bear opened it, and she watched his face as he read. He read for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "This is very good news, Martha, and also very bad news." "Tell me both," she said. "The good news is that this agreement is registered, notarized, and legally binding, and it gives your neighbor's water rights a protected interest in this property that Ralston cannot easily override." He paused. "The bad news is that if he has lawyers who understand water law, and I promise you he does, then he already knows about this spring. And he already knows what controlling it would mean." "He wants the spring more than he wants the house," Martha said. "He wants the spring more than he wants anything," Bear said. "The house is just the way in." The back door opened and Rabbit and Marcus came in, stamping snow from their boots, faces red from the cold, and stopped when they read the room. Marcus looked at Bear, then at Martha, then at the documents spread across the table, and said simply, "Bad complicated," Bear said. "Same thing," Marcus said, and pulled off his coat. Rabbit was looking at Martha with the particular, open concern of a young person who has not yet learned to hide it, and he said, "Martha, are you okay?" She looked at him, this 28-year-old, with the sleep crease on his face and the earnest eyes, and she made a decision about how to answer that question that she had also made 1,000 times before in situations. That required her to be the steady person in the room. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm angry, which is not the same as not fine. Anger is useful. Panic is not." She stood up from the table. "I'm going to make more coffee." She made more coffee. And while she made it, Dennis quietly photographed every document in Walter's file with his phone, and Bear dictated a message to Evelyn Shaw's office number. And Pete went back to the workshop and started drawing something on the back of a county tax notice with a stubby pencil, which turned out to be a preliminary assessment of what the roof repair would actually require. None of them asked her permission for any of this. They simply did it with the quiet, coordinated efficiency of people who had decided that something needed doing and were doing it. Martha watched them and felt something that she could not entirely name and did not try to, because the coffee needed watching and because naming things could wait. It was 10:43 when Bear's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his face did something that Martha had not seen it do yet, a fast, involuntary shift that was part recognition and part urgency, and that he contained almost immediately, pulling it back behind the measured surface. But she had seen it in that half second, and she said, "What?" He looked up. "Evelyn," he said, and the rest of the chapter. "The highway's cleared 1 lane. They're coming." "Your people?" Martha said. 50 of them, Bear said. "Give or take." The kitchen went very quiet. Rabbit said, "Bear, how many did you message last night?" "All of them," Bear said simply. Dennis set down the stack of documents he was holding. He looked at Bear with an expression that mixed something like pride with something like complete absence of surprise. In the way of a man who has known Another man, long enough to have stopped being surprised by him and started simply expecting it. Martha was looking at Bear with a different expression entirely. "You told them to come here," she said. "I told them what was happening," he said. "What they decided to do with that information was their own choice." 50 people, she said. 50 riders, he said. Plus Evelyn. Plus 2 trucks, from the sound of it. "What's in the trucks?" she said. And Bear looked at her with the Winter Creek eyes and said, "Whatever you need, Martha. Whatever you need." She turned away from him and went to the window and looked out at the yard and the road and the cleared lane that Marcus and Rabbit had cut through the driveway snow. And she stood there for a moment with her back to the room and her hands at her sides and her jaw set hard against whatever was trying to happen to her face. She would not cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in front of 6 biker strangers in her kitchen over an act of generosity she had not asked for and had not expected and had, if she was being fully honest with herself, almost stopped believing was a thing that happened in the world. She was going to allow herself exactly 5 seconds with her back to the room. 1, 2, 3, 4. "All right," she said, turning back around. "If 50 people are coming to my property, I need to know what for. I need to understand what is happening on my own land. And I need someone to tell me exactly what Evelyn Shaw found in those documents. Because this is my fight, not yours, and I will not be a bystander in my own life." Bear looked at her steadily. Then he said, "Sit down, Martha. I'll tell you everything." She sat, and he told her. Evelyn Shaw had been with the Montana chapter for 11 years, first as a retained attorney, and then as a member spouse, and then simply as a person who had found her people and stayed. She was 44 years old and had spent 8 of those years doing pro bono work for rural landowners because she had grown up on a ranch in Chouteau County and understood what it meant to watch someone try to take what your family had built. She was, Bear said, the best legal mind he had ever seen in a room, and the most dangerous, because she was also the calmest. What Evelyn had found in 45 minutes of reviewing the photographed documents was this. The foreclosure notice sent to Martha was based on a tax lien that Ralston's company had purchased 18 months earlier. That lien was legitimate. The original debt was real, modest, and had arisen from a billing error that Martha had disputed by mail twice without resolution. But the amount Ralston's attorneys had presented for the outstanding balance was inflated by 32% through a series of fee additions that used invalid county code numbers that corresponded to no actual fee in Montana's property tax statute. Furthermore, Evelyn had noted something that no one else had caught, the notification requirement. Under Montana law, when a tax lien holder escalates to foreclosure proceedings, they are required to send certified written notice to the property owner at the address of record a minimum of 90 days before filing. Martha had received no such notice at her property address. The foreclosure letter had been sent, Evelyn could see from the county filing, but it had been addressed to a post office box in the name of Walter R. Calloway, a box that had been closed since 2015. Walter had been dead since 2016. His post office box had expired the year before he died. Whoever had filed the foreclosure paperwork had used an address they knew to be invalid. Martha listened to all of this without speaking. "Bear finished?" she said. "They sent the notice somewhere they knew I wouldn't get it." "Yes," Bear said. "So that the 90 days would run out." "Yes." "And then show up at my door with a county deputy and a noon deadline, expecting me to have no idea this was coming." "That's what we believe," Bear said. Martha sat with that for a moment. She turned it over in her mind and looked at it from each angle and let herself feel, fully and honestly, what it actually was. This was not an administrative error. This was not a billing dispute or a misunderstanding. This was a calculated, deliberate plan to take her home from her using paperwork as a weapon against a woman who was alone and who they had reason to believe would not know how to fight back. They had been almost right. "The deputy who's coming with Ralston this morning," Martha said. "Is he part of it?" "Probably not," Bear said. "Probably just doing his job, which means he's going to be shown the foreclosure notice and told to enforce it, and he's going to expect a straightforward removal because that's what the paperwork will tell him this is. But Evelyn is going to be here. Evelyn is going to be here, Bear confirmed. And she's been on the phone with the county assessor's office since 7 this morning. Garza, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table through all of this, spoke for the first time in what felt like hours. He had a voice that was lower and more deliberate than you expected from someone his size, and he chose his words carefully, and he said, "Martha, I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I grew up watching my grandfather fight to keep 30 acres in New Mexico for 20 years, he said. Different state, same playbook. These people, the ones who do this, they count on you feeling alone. They count on the paperwork being confusing and the legal language being scary and the pride keeping you from picking up the phone and asking for help." He paused. "You're not alone today." Martha looked at him for a moment and then she said, "Thank you, Garza." She said it simply, without decoration, because that was the kind of thing that deserved a simple answer. Then she stood up and said, "I need to get dressed. If 50 people and a county deputy are going to be in my yard this morning, I am not meeting them in my kitchen cardigan." She went to her bedroom. She put on the good blue blouse and Walter's favorite cardigan, the dark green one, not the kitchen one, and her best jeans and her proper boots. She looked at herself in the mirror above the dresser for about 4 seconds, which was approximately 3.5 seconds longer than she usually spent on such things. And then she went back to the kitchen. The men were ready. Bear had his jacket on and his arm in the makeshift support she had fashioned from a dish towel the night before. Dennis had the documents organized in the folder that Martha had used for 40 years of Walter's careful record keeping. Pete had his assessment notes. Marcus was standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, looking out at the road. "They're here," Marcus said. Martha came to stand beside him. She looked out the window. The road was still mostly empty, but in the distance, coming from the direction of the highway, there was movement. A dark line of shapes, still too far to resolve into detail, moving slowly through the single cleared lane, coming toward her. And on the other side, from the direction of the county seat, a single black SUV was turning onto the road that led to her property. Moving faster, Martha looked at the SUV. She looked at the dark line of shapes coming from the other direction. She thought about the spring. She thought about Walter's filing cabinet. She thought about invented fees and expired post office boxes and a plan so calculated it had required 18 months to set in motion. She set down her coffee mug on the counter. "Bear," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tell your people to stay calm. Whatever Ralston says, whatever the deputy says, nobody does anything except stand there and be exactly who they are." Bear looked at her. The almost smile was there again at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Because the truth is on our side," she said. "And it doesn't need help from anyone's temper. Not his, not mine, not yours." "Understood," Bear said. She walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, into the cold February morning, and she stood there in the good blouse and Walter's green cardigan, and she watched the dark line on the road resolve itself into shapes she could recognize: motorcycles, 2 by 2, moving slowly and steadily through the snow-cleared lane, and she watched the black SUV pull into the far end of her driveway and stop. The sound of 50 engines reached her across the snow, low and steady and unhurried, a sound that she had never heard directed at her before and that she would remember for the rest of her life. Bear came to stand beside her on the porch. Then Dennis, then Rabbit, then Marcus, then Pete, then Garza. 6 men who had knocked on her door 16 hours ago, half frozen and desperate, standing behind her now, on the porch of the house Walter built, watching 50 more of their people come up the road. A car door opened from the black SUV. Dean Ralston stepped out. Dean Ralston was the kind of man who had never once, in his adult life, walked into a room he did not believe he already owned. Martha could see it from the porch, the way he got out of the SUV, the way he straightened his coat, the way he looked at the farmhouse with his head tilted at the particular angle of a person taking inventory of something that already belongs to them in all the ways that matter to them. He was maybe 60, trim and silver-haired, and he wore the kind of winter coat that costs more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. He had a younger man with him, an attorney. From the look of the briefcase and behind the SUV, a county deputy's vehicle pulled up and parked. He had not yet looked at the road behind him. The motorcycles were still coming. They came in two columns, slow and deliberate, filling the single cleared lane from edge to edge. The sound of them had been building for the past 2 minutes, and it was now something that you felt in your chest and as much as heard with your ears, not loud, not aggressive, just steady and enormous and completely present. Two trucks rolled behind them, both loaded high with lumber and equipment visible under tied-down tarps. Ralston turned. Martha watched him turn. She watched the moment he registered what he was looking at, and she watched his face do the very human thing that very confident men's faces do when the world fails to behave the way they have arranged for it to behave, a rapid sequence of adjustments, each one trying to catch up with the last, none of them fully landing. His jaw tightened. His chin came up. He looked back at the farmhouse, at the porch, at Martha, standing there in the green cardigan with 6 large men arranged behind her. He made a decision she could see it happen to proceed, as if the motorcycles were a complication and not a catastrophe. He was a man who had dealt with complications before. He squared his shoulders and started walking toward the house. The deputy got out of his vehicle. He was younger than Martha had expected, mid-30s, rangy, with a cautious expression that told her he had not been fully briefed on what he was walking into. He looked at the motorcycles, and then at Ralston, and then at the porch, and she could see him recalibrating in real time. Bear said quietly, from just behind her right shoulder, steady. She had not needed the reminder, but she appreciated it. Ralston stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked up at Martha with the practiced pleasantness of a man who uses pleasantness the way other men use tools, not because he feels it, but because it gets the job done. He said, Mrs. Calloway, I'm Dean Ralston. I believe you've received our correspondence. I have, Martha said. Then you understand why we're here. I understand why you think you're here, she said. That's a somewhat different thing. His pleasantness recalibrated slightly. He glanced at Bear and then deliberately away from Bear, which was the move of a man who had decided not to acknowledge something he did not want to give weight to. Mrs. Calloway, this is a legal matter. The county has authorized the transfer of title based on the outstanding tax lien. Deputy Marsh is here to ensure the process is, Mr. Ralston. The voice came from the driveway, not from the porch. From the driveway, where the first motorcycles had reached the yard and stopped, and where a woman had gotten out of the lead truck and was walking toward them with the kind of walk that courtrooms create in people who spend enough time in them, unhurried, precise, consuming exactly the space she chose to consume, and not 1 inch more. Evelyn Shaw was 44 years old and built like a woman who had grown up working and had never stopped. Her blonde hair was pulled back under a wool hat, and she was carrying a document case in one hand and her phone in the other. And she looked at Dean Ralston with the expression of a person who has read every page of every document you have ever filed and has found exactly what she was looking for. Ralston looked at her. And you are? Evelyn Shaw. I'm Mrs. Calloway's attorney. She said it without breaking stride. She climbed the porch steps and stood beside Martha and opened her document case. Before Deputy Marsh does anything, I need about 3 minutes of his time. The deputy looked at Ralston, then at Evelyn. Then he made the choice that cautious, honest men make when they are standing between a lawyer with documents and a developer with money. He looked at the documents. 3 minutes, he said. Ralston said, this is a validated court filing. There's nothing to, Mr. Ralston, Evelyn said, still without looking at him, her attention entirely on the deputy. I'm going to ask you to let me finish. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone who is very good at what they do says something simple with complete conviction. Even Bear didn't move. Evelyn laid the documents on the porch railing and walked the deputy through it with the methodical clarity of someone who has explained complicated things to non-specialists 100 times and has learned that. The most powerful presentation is the simplest one. The required notification, the certified mail requirement, the address of record, the post office box in the name of Walter R. Calloway, the box closure date, the death certificate on file with the county showing Walter's date of passing, the gap, the deliberate, provable gap between the notification that was legally required and the notification that was actually sent. Then the fee codes, 3 line items, invalid county codes, numbers that corresponded to nothing in the Montana property tax statute. Evelyn had pulled the actual statute on her phone at 6 that morning and had the relevant sections highlighted. The deputy read. He read slowly and he read twice, which told Martha something good about him. Rolston's attorney was trying to intervene. He had been trying to intervene since the second document. His voice had the quality of a man who is very good at speaking over people in confined spaces and who has not yet understood that today's space is not confined enough for that to work. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She simply continued speaking to the deputy at the same pace and volume, with the same precision, as if the attorney's interjections were ambient noise rather than argument. The deputy looked up from the documents. He looked at Ralston. He said, "Sir, I can't enforce this today." The 3 seconds that followed were very quiet. Ralston said, "Excuse me? The notification requirement isn't satisfied," the deputy said. He said it evenly, not combatively, in the way of someone who understands that what he is doing is simply reading the law back at the situation, and that the law is, in this instance, entirely clear. If the required notice was sent to an address that wasn't current, the 90-day period hasn't legally run. I can't remove someone from their property on a filing that doesn't meet the notification standard. Deputy Marsh, Ralston said, and the pleasantness was gone now, replaced with something that was not quite anger yet, but was the thing that lives right next door to anger in men who are accustomed to not being told, "No, this has been processed and approved by the county assessor's office. The paperwork is in order." "The paperwork has problems," the deputy said, and he said it simply, "the way you say things you are certain of." Martha felt Bear exhale beside her, a slow, controlled exhale, the kind that means the thing you were braced for did not arrive. Not yet, but you stay braced. Ralston turned to his attorney. They had a brief, tight exchange, voices low, faces close together, and then Ralston turned back to the porch and looked at Martha with a look that had dropped the pleasantness entirely and was now something more honest and therefore something more useful for Martha to understand. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to get a court order. And when I do, none of this," he gestured at the yard, at the motorcycles, at Evelyn, at all of it, "none of this will matter." Martha looked at him steadily. She said, "Mr. Ralston, what you're looking for on this property is the spring." He went very still. It was the stillness of a man who has been hit in a place he did not expect to be hit, and the stillness lasted exactly long enough to confirm everything Bear had told her that morning. "I don't know what you're—" "Yes," Martha said, "you do. My husband registered that spring in 1981. The water rights are tied to this property and shared with 3 neighboring ranches under a notarized county agreement. If you get this land, you get control of the water supply for the Eastern Valley." She paused. "That's what the resort entrance needs. That's what makes this particular 42 acres worth the trouble of falsifying fees and mailing foreclosure notices to a dead man's post office box." The yard was completely silent. 50 riders, standing beside their bikes in the snow, all of them still. Evelyn beside Martha with her document case. The deputy holding the papers. Ralston's attorney put a hand on his client's arm. Ralston looked at Martha for a long moment, with an expression that she recognized as the look of a man revising his understanding of the situation he is in. She had seen it on men, the moment when what they thought was a simple transaction reveals itself to have dimensions they did not account for. It was not a pleasant expression to receive, but she found she was not frightened by it. "We'll be in touch," Ralston said. He turned around. He walked back to the SUV. His attorney followed. The deputy waited until they had reached the vehicle before he turned to Martha and said, "Quietly, ma'am, you should get a formal legal response filed as soon as possible. Today, if you can." "We'll file by end of business," Evelyn said. The deputy nodded once. He looked at the yard, at the 50 riders, at the trucks, at the lumber peeking out from under the tarps, and something moved in his face that might have been surprise and might have been something else. He said, "Good luck, Mrs. Calloway," and got back in his vehicle. The SUV pulled out. The deputy followed, and they were gone. The yard was still quiet for about 4 seconds. Then someone Martha would never know who started a slow clap, and it spread through the riders. The way these things spread when the feeling behind them is real, until 50 pairs of gloved hands were making a sound that carried across the snow and mucked back from the tree line and settled over everything like warmth. Martha stood on her porch and looked out at all of it, the motorcycles, the trucks, the faces turned toward her, 50 people who had gotten up before dawn and driven through post-blizzard roads because a message on a thin signal had told them someone needed standing beside, and she felt something move through her that she had no word for. Something that was too large for gratitude and too specific for joy, and that had in it, underneath everything, the particular quality of a woman who has been very alone for a very long time, understanding, with her whole body, that she is not anymore. She did not cry. She had decided that in the kitchen, but it was close. Bear came to stand beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a moment, she said, "Well, let's get to work." What happened next had the quality of a very well-rehearsed operation by people who had never actually rehearsed it together, but who shared enough of the same instincts and the same values that the choreography emerged naturally. Evelyn went inside with her laptop and Walter's files and the kitchen table and 3 hours of focused, undistracted work. 2 riders who turned out to be a retired tax investigator named Harold Briggs and a county records specialist named Susan Tate set up at the far end of the table with their own notes and started building the formal legal response. Outside, the work was already underway. Pete had been carrying his roof assessment notes in his jacket pocket since breakfast, and he was on the barn phone within 10 minutes of Rolston's departure, calling a supplier in Missoula about shingles and decking board. The 2 trucks were unloaded lumber, heating supplies, roofing materials, an industrial extension cord, a propane space heater for the workshop, with the organized efficiency of a moving crew that has been doing this for years. A man named Cruz, stocky and methodical, had the furnace panel open inside of 20 minutes and was talking to Rabbit about what it needed, which turned out to be a replacement heat exchanger that Cruz happened to have in his truck because, as he explained without particular drama, he had been replacing heat exchangers in rural Montana homes for 16 years and had learned to carry one at all times. Martha moved through all of it. She was not a woman who could stand still while work happened around her, and she would not start being one today. She made coffee a full pot every 40 minutes, cycling through it until she had used the last of her ground coffee, and then someone who produced a 2-pound bag of the same brand from one of the trucks, which she chose not to examine too closely in terms of its implications for her independence, and chose instead to accept as the practical gift it was. She brought sandwiches out at noon. She had enough bread for 12, and there were 50-some people outside, and so she brought what she had, and Evelyn, without looking up from her laptop, reached into her bag and produced 3 $20 bills and said, "Send someone to the grocery in town. Tell them it's for Martha's yard." Before Martha could object, 2 riders had taken the money and the keys to one of the trucks. They were back in 40 minutes with sandwich supplies for 60, 2 cases of water, and a box of cookies that someone had apparently decided was necessary, which Martha could not argue with. She was standing at the kitchen counter making sandwiches more than she had made at one time since the church social 2 summers ago, when Evelyn looked up from the table and said, "Martha, come look at this." Martha came. Evelyn had the county property records open on her laptop alongside a spreadsheet she had been building for the past 2 hours. She turned the screen and said, "Do you know a woman named Ruth Hensley, 71 years old, property on the north side of the valley, about 8 miles from here?" "Ruth taught kindergarten in Silver Creek for 30 years, Martha said. "She retired in 2014. Her husband passed the year after. Her property went to tax lien 14 months ago," Evelyn said. "Same method. Inflated fees using invalid code numbers. She paid what she could, and Rolston's group bought the remaining lien." She scrolled. Earl and Dorothy Pittman, 68 and 72, South Valley. Property encumbered by a lien Ralston's company holds since 8 months ago. She scrolled again. James Rutherford, 74, widower, northeast corner of the county. Lien date 13 months ago. She looked up. Martha, I've found 5 more in the past 2 hours. I think there are more I haven't gotten to yet. Martha looked at the screen, at the names, at the dates and the numbers and the pattern that was now undeniable. He's been doing this for years, she said. At least 3 years that I can document from what's publicly available, Evelyn said. And he chose the same type of target each time. Elderly, widowed or single, fixed income, rural. People who have been on their land so long they don't question the paperwork. People who are too proud to ask for help. Martha said, people like me. People exactly like you, Evelyn said, without softening it, because Martha was not the kind of woman who needed softening. The difference between you and Ruth Hensley and Earl and Dorothy Pittman is that last night 6 men knocked on your door instead of someone else's. Martha stood at the kitchen table and looked at the list of names on Evelyn's screen and felt something that was beyond personal. It moved through the anger she had been carrying all morning and into something larger and colder and more purposeful, the particular quality of a woman who has just understood that this is not her problem alone and has not been for a long time, and who is the kind of woman who does not, once she has understood a thing, allow herself to unknow it. What do we do? She said. We file today, Evelyn said. Your case, specifically the invalid notification, the false fee codes, that's solid. Ralston's foreclosure on your property will be challenged, and I believe we win it. But the other cases are going to require, she paused, choosing the word carefully, a coordinated effort. Someone needs to contact these other property owners. Someone needs to review their documentation. Someone needs to establish a pattern for the county to look at and the state attorney's office to look at. Do you have the bandwidth for that? Martha said. Evelyn looked at her with an expression that was dry and direct and slightly amused. Martha, I've been doing pro bono rural property work for 8 years on top of my regular practice. I have a very understanding partnership and an extremely patient husband and 2 paralegals who are both accustomed to me calling them on weekends. What I need is access. Access to the property owners, access to their files and time. The property owners will talk to me, Martha said. I know Ruth Hensley. I went to church with Dorothy Pittman for 20 years. Good, Evelyn said. Then you're not just a client anymore. You're the first link in a chain. Martha looked at that for a moment. Then she said, what about Walter Spring? The water rights agreement? Evelyn turned back to her screen. Harold is working on that right now. The agreement is registered and binding. But I want to understand the full scope of what Ralston was trying to do before I decide how to use it. Water rights disputes in Montana can go to the state water court. And if this is part of a broader resort development plan that involves controlling valley water access, it becomes a significantly larger legal matter than a simple property fraud case. Larger how? Martha said. Larger as in potentially involving the state attorney general, Evelyn said. If we can demonstrate that the pattern of property acquisition was designed to achieve control over water resources that have existing public and private interests. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment, except for the sound of the work happening outside, hammering now, from the roof, where Pete and 2 others had started pulling damaged shingles, and the low hum of voices from the table where Harold and Susan worked. Bear appeared in the doorway from the living room. He had been in and out all morning, managing the outside operation with his one good arm and his phone, and what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply of calm authority. He looked at Evelyn's screen. He looked at Martha. How many, he said. At least 11, Evelyn said. Possibly more. Bear said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Ruth Hensley, does she know about Ralston's method? Probably not, Martha said. She probably thinks she made mistakes. That's what they count on, that you'll believe it's your own fault. Bear's jaw tightened. She had seen that particular tightening several times now, and she understood what it meant, which was that the thing he was feeling was significant enough to require active management. he said quietly. This is not a property dispute. No, Evelyn said. It's a fraud operation. Then we document it, Bear said. All of it. Every property. Every name. Every false fee code. He looked at Martha. Can you make the calls? I can make the calls, Martha said. Then let's move, he said. He went back outside. Martha went to the phone on the kitchen wall. She called Ruth Hensley first, because she had known Ruth the longest, and because Ruth would be the hardest, and she had learned in 73 years to do the hard things first, while she still had the full morning's energy behind her. Ruth answered on the second ring with the cautious hello of a woman who has been getting too many calls from numbers she does not recognize. Ruth, Martha said, it's Martha Calloway. I need you to listen to me for a few minutes, and I need you not to say anything until I'm done. Because what I'm going to tell you is complicated and important, and I don't want to lose it in the interruptions. A pause. Then Ruth said, Martha, are you all right? I'm better than I've been in a month, Martha said. Now listen. She talked for 12 minutes. She told Ruth about the foreclosure notice. She told Ruth about the fee codes that did not exist. She told Ruth about the notification that was sent to a dead man's postal address. She told Ruth what Evelyn Shaw had found in 2 hours of review, and she told Ruth what it meant. Then she said, Ruth, I need you to pull every piece of paper you have that came from the county or from Ralston's group in the last 3 years, and I need you to call me back. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, with the specific quality of a woman who has spent 14 months believing she simply didn't understand her own finances, Martha, are you telling me this wasn't my mistake? It was never your mistake, Martha said. It was done to you. On purpose. The sound Ruth Hensley made then was not crying exactly. It was the sound of a pressure releasing that has been built up for so long that the person carrying it has stopped noticing how heavy it was. I'll call you back in an hour, Ruth said. Martha hung up and called Dorothy Pittman. Outside, the hammering continued. Crews had the furnace running by 2 o'clock and came to the kitchen door to report it with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who has done his job correctly, and Martha thanked him, and he nodded once and went back to help with the roof. Rabbit, who had been hauling materials up and down the ladder all afternoon, appeared in the doorway with a scrape on his forearm from the ladder rail and asked if Martha had a bandage. And she sat him down and cleaned it, taped it without ceremony, and sent him back, and he went, grinning, as if being sent back to work by a 73-year-old woman was exactly the right outcome. By 4 in the afternoon, Evelyn had the formal legal response ready to file electronically with the county court. She read the summary aloud to Martha, who listened standing up, arms folded, and said at the end, "That's accurate. File it." Evelyn filed it. Harold had completed his analysis of the water rights agreement and presented it to Bear and Martha together at the kitchen table. The agreement was iron. Walter had been thorough in a way that had been, clearly, an act of profound foresight. He had had the spring surveyed by a licensed hydrologist, had the shared use agreement witnessed by 2 attorneys and notarized, and had filed it with both the county recorder's office and the state water resources division. Anyone who tried to control that spring through ownership of Martha's property would be walking directly into a protected water rights structure that predated their interest by 40 years. Bear said. When Harold finished, he built her a shield and she didn't even know it was there. Martha said, "Walter always said you do the paperwork right the first time because someday it might be the only thing standing between you and someone who wants what you have." She paused. I thought he was talking about cattle. Something moved around the table that was close to a laugh and close to something else. At 5 o'clock, Ruth Hensley called back. She had found her file. She had found 3 fee codes that she had never questioned because they looked official, and she trusted official-looking things. Evelyn took the phone and talked to Ruth for 20 minutes in the measured, precise way she talked when she was building something from what she was hearing. And when she hung up, she said, "Same codes, different property, same company." Martha was already dialing Dorothy Pittman's number. The riders had started a fire in the barrel near the workshop, A legitimate burn barrel that Martha had used for decades, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the kitchen window, along with the sound of conversation, occasional laughter, the specific quality of sound that comes from a large group of people who are engaged in purposeful work and feel the satisfaction of it. Someone had brought a guitar. She had not asked how that was possible. It was simply true. Bear came in from outside around 5:30 and stood at the kitchen counter and drank a glass of water and looked at the organized chaos of the kitchen, Evelyn's documents, Harold's notes, the coffee mugs, the phone. Martha herself at the center of all of it. And he said, "You doing okay?" "I'm doing something," she said. "I haven't decided what to call it yet." "I'll tell you what to call it," he said. "You're fighting back." She considered that. She looked at the phone, which had been in her hand for most of the afternoon, and at Evelyn's laptop, and at Walter's green filing cabinet still open in the corner, and at the list of names, 11 of them now. 11 neighbors and strangers who had been targeted by the same method and the same man, and she said, "Bear." When Ralston said he'd come back with a court order. "Yes," Bear said. "He means it." "He means it," Bear agreed. "So this isn't finished today?" "No," he said. "It's not finished today. But today we established that it can be finished and that you don't have to finish it alone. And that the person who thought he was walking into an empty yard this morning was wrong about almost everything he brought with him." He set down his water glass. "That's not nothing, Martha. That's actually quite a lot." She looked at him for a moment. This man with the Winter Creek eyes and the injured shoulder and the 2 trucks full of lumber, the 50 riders in her yard, who had come because he sent a message on a thin signal at midnight, and she thought about all the ways the world surprises you when you stop expecting it to. She said, "Your shoulder needs ice." He almost laughed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "she got the ice." And outside, in the cold that was losing its edge, as the afternoon turned toward evening, a roofer's hammer rang out against the darkening sky, and 50 motorcycles stood in the snow like a promise that had already been kept, and the workshop window threw a warm rectangle of light across the yard because crews had gunpowder running, and the smell of wood smoke and coffee drifted together through the cold air over everything. Ralston had left, but what he had set in motion was not going to stop here. Martha knew it. Evelyn knew it. And somewhere in a black SUV moving back toward the county seat, Dean Ralston was on his phone with his attorney, and he was recalculating, and he was very likely, for the first time in a long time, not entirely certain of the outcome. That uncertainty was the first real thing Martha Calloway had won. It would not be the last. Ruth Hensley arrived at Martha's farm the following morning in her 10-year-old Subaru with a cardboard box on the passenger seat and the particular expression of a woman who has not slept and has spent the sleepless hours doing something productive with the insomnia. She knocked on the door, and when Martha opened it, Ruth held up the box and said, 3 years of paperwork. Every letter, every bill, every notice I got from that man's company. I couldn't eat until I found all of it. Martha took the box from her hands and said, "Come in and have coffee." Ruth came in. She was a small woman, 71, with white hair, cut short and practical, and the careful call posture of someone who has spent decades at a child's eye level and has never entirely straightened back up. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Evelyn's laptop and Harold's notes and the organized stacks of Walter's documents that had become a permanent feature of the kitchen over the past 18 hours, and she said, "Martha, how did you know? How did you figure out what he was doing?" "I didn't," Martha said. "Someone figured it out for me." She handed Ruth a mug of coffee and sat down across from her. "And now we're going to figure it out for everyone else." Evelyn came through from the living room, where she had been on the phone since 7 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes, which she had addressed by borrowing one of Martha's flannel shirts and looking entirely comfortable in it. She sat down at the table and opened Ruth's box and began pulling files and organizing them with the focused efficiency of a person who processes documents the way other people breathe automatically, continuously, without apparent effort. She found the first false fee code in 4 minutes. She found the second in 7. She looked up at Ruth and said, "Did anyone ever explain to you what these line items were for?" Ruth said, I called the number on the letter twice. Both times I got a recording. Evelyn said, of course you did. She said it without surprise, which made it worse somehow. The complete absence of surprise that a system designed to confuse had successfully confused. Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and said, I thought I just didn't understand it. I thought it was my fault for not understanding. It was designed to look like your fault, Evelyn said. That's different. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have a daughter in Seattle. She offered to help me 3 times, and I told her I was fine because I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed that I couldn't manage my own property tax. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing work. 14 months I carried that. Martha reached across the table and put her hand over Ruth's. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say about 14 months of unnecessary shame, and so she simply left her hand there and let the contact be what it was. Bear appeared in the kitchen doorway from outside, still in his jacket, phone in his good hand. He had been managing 2 things simultaneously since dawn: the ongoing work on Martha's property, which was entering its 2nd day, and the expanding investigation, which now had a life of its own. He looked at Ruth, whom he had not met, and said, You're Ruth Hensley. Ruth looked up at this very large man in a leather jacket and said, with the composure of a woman who taught kindergarten for 30 years and is therefore unintimidated by almost anything, I am, and you are? Bear, he said. I'm the reason Martha's roof got fixed. Then I'm pleased to meet you, Ruth said. He nodded once, which was his version of a full social exchange, and said to Evelyn, Harold just got off the phone with the county assessor's research office. The clerk there, woman named Patricia Doyle, wants to talk to us. She says she has something. Evelyn looked up from Ruth's documents. What kind of something? She wouldn't say on the phone, Bear said. But Harold says she sounded like a person who has been waiting to say it for a while. The county assessor's office was 22 miles from Martha's farmhouse, in the county seat, and the road was clear enough by 9 in the morning that Evelyn and Harold made the drive in Harold's truck while Martha stayed home and continued calling through the list of names that Evelyn had compiled: 11 property owners spread across Silver Creek Valley, all of them elderly, all of them holding a Rolston-related tax lien, all of them, as Martha was learning one call at a time, carrying a version of the same weight Ruth Hensley had carried for 14 months. Dorothy Pittman cried on the phone. Not the theatrical kind of crying, but the quiet, private kind that happens when a person discovers that the thing they have been blaming themselves for was never their fault. And the relief and the anger arrive at exactly the same moment, and the body doesn't know how to hold both without leaking. Martha talked her through it. She had developed, over the course of the morning, a rhythm for these calls: the same information, delivered in the same plain, clear language, followed by the same 2 questions. Do you have your paperwork? And can someone come to you today? The answer to the first question was always yes, because these were people who had grown up in a time when you kept your paperwork. And the answer to the second question, she had stopped asking, because Bear had already arranged it. 2 writers, women, both of them, which Martha had noticed and appreciated, without commenting on, were driving the circuit of properties, collecting documents, sitting with the property owners long enough to make sure they understood what was happening and to make sure they were not alone with the information. James Rutherford, 74, northeast corner of the county, said when Martha explained it to him, I knew something was wrong. I went to the assessor's office myself last spring, and the man at the counter looked at my paperwork for 60 seconds and told me the fees were valid. Told me to my face. Martha said, which man at the counter, young fellow? Dark hair. Wore a tie, which I thought was unusual for a county office. Martha wrote down the description and called Evelyn's cell phone immediately and relayed it. There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Evelyn said, in the careful tone of someone who is not yet ready to say what she is thinking, that's interesting, keep going. 2 more calls, 2 more confirmations of the same fee codes, and then Martha got to a name near the bottom of Evelyn's list that stopped her. Frank and Carolyn Delaney, ages 69 and 73. Property on the western edge of the valley. The notation next to their names, which Evelyn had added in her careful shorthand, read, "Lien transferred may have already sold." Martha sat with that for a moment. Then she called the number. A woman answered. Older voice. Tired in the way that is not about the time of day. "Mrs. Delaney," Martha said. "My name is Martha Calloway. I'm your neighbor, about 12 miles east. I don't know if we've ever met in person, but I'm calling about a property matter, and I think you need to hear what I have to say." The silence on the other end had a quality Martha recognized. The silence of a person who already knows something bad is coming and is gathering themselves. "We sold the property," Carolyn Delaney said, 8 months ago. "Frank didn't want to. He cried the night we signed the papers. We'd been on that land for 31 years. A pause. "We sold it to Rolston's company. They said it was the only way to settle the tax debt. They said we could stay through the end of the year as renters, and then we'd have to find somewhere else." Another pause. Longer. "We're at my daughter's house in Billings right now." Martha closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. "Mrs. Delaney," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." She told Carolyn Delaney everything. She told her about the false fee codes and the invalid notification and the water rights and the 11 other properties and Evelyn Shaw and what was being filed with the county court and what might be filed with the state attorney general. She told her all of it, plainly and completely, because Carolyn Delaney had already lost the hardest thing and deserved to know the full truth of how it had been taken. When she finished, Carolyn Delaney was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Can we get it back?" "I don't know yet," Martha said. "But Evelyn is going to find out. And I want you to know that you and your husband are not going to be left out of this." She heard Carolyn say something to someone in the room, Frank. She assumed too low to make out. Then Carolyn came back to the phone and said, "Frank wants to know who you are." "I'm a farmer," Martha said. "I'm a farmer who almost lost her land yesterday and didn't, and who's trying to make sure the same thing happens for everyone else." Another pause. Then Carolyn said, "Frank says thank you." Martha said, "Tell Frank to hold on. That's all we need him to do right now. Just hold on." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the phone in her hand and the list of names in front of her and the full weight of what Dean Rolston had done to 11 families sitting on her chest like the cold sitting on the farmhouse the night before the bikers knocked on her door. Heavy and real, and something that a person of conscience cannot unknow once they know it. Bear came in from outside and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "The Delaney," she said. "They already sold. 8 months ago." Bear set his phone down on the counter. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Evelyn needs to know." "I'm calling her now," Martha said. Evelyn answered on the first ring. When Martha told her about the Delaneys, the silence on Evelyn's end had a different quality from Ruth's silence or Dorothy's silence. It was the silence of a legal mind processing a specific piece of information against a specific legal framework and arriving at a specific conclusion. Then Evelyn said, "If the sale was coerced through fraudulent debt instruments, it may be voidable. It's complicated and it's not certain, but it is not impossible." "Tell me what you need," Martha said. Their original paperwork. Every document they signed. The sale agreement, the settlement statement, everything. A pause. "And Martha, I need you to prepare yourself for the fact that the county assessor's office may have been involved in this more directly than we initially thought." Martha said, "How directly?" "Patricia Doyle. The clerk Harold and I met with this morning. She's been at that office for 19 years. She told us that 18 months ago, a new deputy assessor was hired. Name is Gary Finch. He handles all tax lien processing. Patricia says she raised questions about some of the fee codes she saw going through Finch's work about 8 months ago and was told by her supervisor to stay in her lane." Evelyn's voice was steady and controlled. "Patricia has kept copies. 19 months of copies. She's been waiting for someone to come ask." The kitchen was very quiet. Martha said, "He had someone inside the assessor's office." "It appears that way," Evelyn said. "Which means the fraud wasn't just in the paperwork Rolston filed. Someone inside county government was facilitating it, reviewing the filings, approving the fee additions, ensuring the processes moved through without the scrutiny they should have received." Martha thought about James Rutherford at the assessor's counter with his paperwork, being told by a man in a tie that the fees were valid. She thought about Ruth Hensley calling a number twice and getting a recording both times. She thought about Carolyn Delaney's voice saying, "Frank didn't want to. He cried the night we signed the papers." She said, "Evelyn, what does this become now?" "It becomes a criminal matter," Evelyn said, "which is outside my specialty, but well within the interest of the State Attorney General's office, which is why Harold is on the phone with them right now." Martha sat with that. The thing she had been calling a property dispute for the past 24 hours had always been larger than that. It had been fraud, organized, deliberate, sustained fraud, directed at specific vulnerable targets by a man with money and a man with access and enough patience to let it run for 3 years without being caught. Almost without being caught. "Evelyn," she said, "is there a hearing? A formal proceeding where all of this gets presented?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "The county commission holds land use and property dispute hearings. Given the scope of what we're building here, 11 affected properties, a suspected inside actor in the assessor's office, the water rights issue, the fraudulent fee codes, I'm going to request an emergency session. I'll need at least some of the affected property owners present. Their testimony matters as much as the documents. They'll come," Martha said. It was not a guess. She hung up and looked at the list of names on the table. 11 families. 11 pieces of land that had been in those families for decades. 11 sets of people who had believed for months or years that they had simply failed to manage something that other people managed without difficulty, and who were learning now that they had been targeted and deceived and that the failure was never theirs. She picked up the phone and started calling them back, one by one, to tell them about the hearing. The hearing was set for 11 days later, on a Thursday, in the county commission meeting room in the county seat. The room held 80 people at capacity, and by 9 in the morning, on the day of the hearing, it was standing room only, with people filling the corridor outside, and a local radio station setting up to broadcast live because the journalist who had been covering the story, a young woman named Cassandra Price from the Silver Creek Courier, who had first heard about it, from a source inside the assessor's office, and then called Martha directly. 3 days after the confrontation in the yard, had been running daily dispatches that had been picked up by the Billings Gazette and then by the AP Wire. Martha sat at the front table with Evelyn on her left and Ruth Hensley on her right, and she kept her hands flat on the table and her back straight, which was both a posture and a decision. The room behind her was full of people she knew and people she didn't, and in the back, 3 rows, riders. Not 50 of them today. The chapter had lives and jobs, and the riders who were here had come specifically and deliberately and were dressed, she noted, in their cleanest cuts with their chapter patches visible, because Bear had made a decision about visibility and what it communicated. He sat in the center of the back row, with his arm finally out of the improvised support the shoulder had begun to heal, enough, and his hands folded in his lap and his face in the steady, watchful expression she had come to know as his default condition. He caught her eye when she turned to look at the room. He nodded once. She nodded back. The commission chair, a woman named Sandra Belk, 60, former school teacher, with the direct manner of someone who has managed rooms full of food for decades and is not intimidated by this one, called the session to order and establish the parameters. This was an evidentiary hearing, not a trial. The commission did not have criminal jurisdiction. What happened here would determine county-level action on the affected properties and would form part of the referral package to the State Attorney General's office, which had already opened a preliminary inquiry. The name Gary Finch, the deputy assessor who had been processing Rolston's filings, was not in the room. He had called in sick to work on Monday and had not been heard from since. This information moved through the room in a quiet wave when Sandra Belk mentioned it, and Martha felt the ripple of it, the particular discomfort that comes from a key piece of the picture choosing to absent itself. Evelyn presented the documentation first. She had spent 11 days building a presentation that was, as she described it to Martha the night before, designed to be understood by anyone in that room, regardless of their familiarity with property law. Because the most important people in the room were not the commissioners, but the 11 families who needed to understand what had been done to them and the community that needed to understand why it mattered. She walked through the fee codes. She put them on the projected screen beside the actual Montana property tax statute. The gap between what Rolston's filings claimed and what the law actually allowed was visible to anyone in the room who could read two columns of numbers side by side. She heard someone in the middle rows say, quietly but audibly, "That's just made up," and the commission chair let it pass because it was accurate. She walked through the notification failures. She presented the post office box history. She presented Walter's death certificate, filed in 2016, and the box closure date of 2015, and the date on the foreclosure notice sent to that address. The timeline was visible, and the implication was inescapable. She walked through the pattern. 11 properties. 3 years. The same fee code numbers on every inflated assessment. The same notification irregularities. The same company name on every lien. She put a map on the screen showing the affected properties scattered across Silver Creek Valley, and then she zoomed out to show what they had in common, their position, relative to the proposed resort development footprint, relative to the valley access road, and relative to the natural spring on Martha's back 40. The room was very quiet for that slide. Then she presented Patricia Doyle. Patricia Doyle was not a dramatic person by nature. She was a county clerk who had worked in the same office for 19 years and kept her head down and done her job. And the fact that she had also kept copies was not, she explained, in the measured voice of a lifelong bureaucrat, a dramatic act. It was simply what you did when you suspected that something was wrong and you did not yet know who to tell. You kept copies and you waited. She had waited 8 months. She presented the copies. They showed Gary Finch's approval signatures on 17 tax lien processing documents over 22 months. They showed, when cross-referenced with Evelyn's fee code analysis, that Finch had approved the false additions on each filing without flagging them for secondary review, which was technically required for any non-standard fee over $500. He had routed them directly to final processing 17 times. The commission chair said, "Ms. Doyle, did you ever raise this with your supervisor directly?" "Once," Patricia said. "In writing, I have the email." She produced the email. Her supervisor's response, also preserved, was 4 words, "Let the process work." The room took a breath. Martha looked at the 11 families seated around her Ruth. The Pittmans, James Rutherford, the others she had spent 11 days calling and meeting and sitting with over kitchen tables, and she watched their faces as Patricia Doyle's evidence assembled itself into a shape they could all see clearly. And she saw on those faces the specific expression of people who have carried blame for something that was done to them and are watching the truth of it become official and public and undeniable. Earl Pittman, 68, who had said almost nothing, in the 3 times Martha had met with him, reached across his wife's hand and squeezed it. Dorothy Pittman closed her eyes for a moment. Martha looked away because that was a private thing. When it was Martha's turn to speak, she stood up without notes. She had written notes and then put them down because she had decided that this was not a moment for notes. She stood at the front of the room and she looked at the commission. And she said what she had been thinking for 11 days, which was this: "I am not here to tell you that I was a victim. I don't believe that word serves me or anyone else in this room. What I am here to tell you is that I am a 73-year-old woman who has lived on the same 42 acres for 41 years. And I almost lost that land not because I failed to pay what I owed, but because someone calculated correctly that I would be too proud to ask for help and too isolated to find it if I tried. And that calculation, that specific, deliberate calculation, was made about every person in this room." She paused. "Dean Rolston did not choose us randomly. He chose us because we fit a profile. Elderly, rural, fixed income, property that has been in our families long enough that we would do almost anything to keep it. He chose us because he knew that the paperwork would confuse us, and the legal language would intimidate us, and the official-looking notices would make us believe we had simply made mistakes that other people did not make. She looked at the faces in the room. We did not make mistakes. We were targeted. There is a profound difference between those two things, and I need the commission and this community and every person in this room to understand that difference before we talk about what happens next. She sat down. The room was completely quiet for about 4 seconds. Then Sandra Belk said, "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." And her voice had a quality that was not quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. The way a voice sounds when a person is maintaining professionalism around something that is trying to be personal. The hearing ran for 4 hours. Evelyn presented the water rights documentation in the second hour, and the commission's water resource consultant, who had been brought in 2 days earlier, confirmed that the spring on Martha's property was the primary source for a watershed that served 7 properties and, through the county's emergency water agreement, provided a backup supply for the town of Silver Creek itself. Rolston's resort development plan, the full plan, which Cassandra Price had obtained through a public records request and which had been City County Planning Office for 8 months pending environmental review, included acquisition of Martha's property as the resort's eastern access point and primary water source. The Commission's own planning officer, when asked directly whether anyone had flagged the conflict between the development plan and the existing water rights agreement, said, after a pause that was slightly too long, that the file had been under active review. Sandra Belk said, "How long has it been under active review?" 8 months, he said. The same 8 months that Gary Finch had been processing the fraudulent liens. The same 8 months that the Delaney's had been pressured into selling. The same 8 months during which 11 families had been systematically stripped of legal ground to stand on while their properties moved, one by one, into range of a development project that could not proceed without controlling the water that sat under Martha Calloway's back 40. At the end of the 4th hour, the Commission voted unanimously to suspend Rolston's development permits pending the outcome of the State Attorney General's investigation. They voted to refer the fee code fraud to the county attorney for criminal review. They voted to initiate a formal inquiry into Gary Finch's conduct and into the supervisor who had told Patricia Doyle to let the process work. And they voted on a motion that Sandra Belk made herself and that passed 4-0 to establish an emergency homeowner review program free, county-funded, attorney-staffed for any Silver Creek resident who believed their property tax documents might contain irregularities. Martha sat through all 4 votes with her hands flat on the table and her back straight. When the last vote passed, Ruth Hensley, sitting to her right, put her hand over Martha's and squeezed once and did not let go. Martha looked down at their 2 hands, 2 old women's hands, marked by decades of work and weather, and she let them stay that way. After the hearing adjourned, Bear found her in the corridor outside the commission room, where she was standing with Dorothy Pittman and James Rutherford and trying to explain to James what the permit suspension actually meant in practical terms. Bear waited patiently until James was satisfied, and then he said, "You were good in there." "I said what needed saying," she said. "That's what good is," he said. She looked at him. She said, "The Delaney's, Carolyn and Frank, their property if the sale gets voided, if Evelyn can actually make that case." "Evelyn believes she can," Bear said. "It's going to take time. It's not going to be simple. But it's possible." "It's possible," he said. Martha nodded. She thought about Frank Delaney crying the night he signed the papers. 31 years of his life transferring to a man who had manufactured the debt that made him sign. She thought about possible, and she decided it was enough to stand on for now. "Bear," she said, "the fundraiser for the legitimate tax debt. Because there was still a real amount owed, a modest one, stripped of the false additions. And Martha had been clear from the beginning that she would not have it paid as charity. You said the chapter would help organize it." "Already started," he said. "Rabbit's handling the social media. Dennis talked to 3 businesses in town this morning. The auto parts place is donating a full-service package for auction, and the diner on Main Street is doing a benefit dinner night." He paused. And Evelyn says Walter's apple preserves recipe is apparently something people have been asking about for years. Martha blinked. Who told Evelyn about the preserves? Ruth Hensley, Bear said, with something that was definitively a smile. Apparently Ruth has been buying them at the church social for a decade and considers them the standard by which all other preserves are measured. Martha stood in the corridor of the county commission building and looked at this man, this biker, with the Winter Creek eyes and the healing shoulder and the chapter of 50, who had come down a mountain road in a February blizzard and changed the entire shape of what she thought her life was going to be. And she felt something move through her that she had no word for and did not try to find one. She said, Walter would have liked you. Bear said, I think I would have liked Walter. She said, he would have wanted to see your bikes. We'll bring them by sometime, Bear said, when the roads are better. She said, I'll make preserves. They stood in the corridor while the room emptied around them. And outside through the building's glass doors, the February light was coming down on a town that did not yet fully know what had just changed inside it. And Martha Calloway, who had almost lost everything and had not, and who had walked through the worst of it with her back straight and her hands steady, stood in that light and let herself, for just one moment, simply breathe. The fundraiser happened on a Saturday in late March, 3 weeks after the county commission hearing, and Martha had not expected it to be what it turned out to be. She had expected a modest community gathering, a few donated items, some neighbors with checkbooks, the kind of quiet, practical generosity that small Montana towns produce when one of their own needs help. She had spent the previous week making 14 jars of Walter's apple preserves, the recipe she had not used since the last church social, the one that required 3 hours of standing at the stove and a particular sequence of timing that she had never written down because she had learned it from her mother-in-law in 1975 and had kept it in her hands ever since. She had stayed up until 11 the night before the event writing labels in her careful cursive, Callaway Apple Preserves, Silver Creek, Montana. And beneath that, in smaller letters, Walter's recipe, 1,975. Bear had told her to make as many as she could. She had not understood why until she pulled into the Silver Creek Community Center parking lot that Saturday morning and found it full. Not the casual, gradual full of a regular community event, but the arrived early and stayed full of people who had made a decision to be there. There were vehicles she recognized and vehicles she did not recognize, including a charter bus from Billings that she later learned had brought 43 people who had read Cassandra Price's story in the Billings Gazette and had driven 3 hours to a fundraiser for a woman they had never met. Rabbit was at the door when she arrived, wearing a clean flannel shirt that someone had clearly made him iron, holding a clipboard and looking approximately as official as a 28-year-old can look when he is trying very hard. He saw Martha's car and was down the steps before she had the door fully open. Martha, he said, taking the box of preserves from her, we have a situation. What kind of situation? She said. The good kind, he said, with the grin that she had come to recognize as his default expression when things were going better than expected. We sold out the auction items at 9 this morning, before the event even officially opened. Dennis had to call the auto parts supplier for more inventory. Martha looked at him. It's 9:45. Yes, ma'am, he said. It's been a morning inside. The community center was arranged the way community centers are arranged for events of optimistic ambition tables along the walls. A stage at the far end, a sound system that someone had rented and that was currently playing Merle Haggard at a respectful volume. What Martha had not anticipated was that every table was occupied and that the room held, at a rough count that she made as she moved through it, somewhere between 200 and 300 people. Ruth Hensley found her within 2 minutes, which was easy because Ruth had been stationed near the door specifically to find her. Ruth was wearing her good jacket, and her cheeks were high-colored with the particular excitement of a woman who has been carrying anxiety for so long that the presence of its opposite feels almost physically overwhelming. She grabbed Martha's arm and said, Martha, There's a man here from the state attorney general's office. Martha stopped walking. Today, at the fundraiser? He came privately, Ruth said. He's not here officially. He told Dennis he just wanted to. He said he wanted to see what kind of community this is. She leaned slightly closer. Dennis says he's been here since 8:30. Martha looked across the room and found Dennis in the crowd, the compass rose tattoo visible on the back of his hand as he gestured to a tall man in a civilian jacket near the coffee station. The tall man was listening to Dennis with the attentive expression of someone who is absorbing everything he is hearing and filing it carefully. She went over. Dennis saw her coming and said, "Martha, this is Robert Ames. He's with the AG's office." Robert Ames was maybe 50, lean, with a quiet face and the kind of handshake that is firm without being demonstrative. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be clear that I'm not here in any official capacity today. I came because I've been following this case, and I wanted to understand the community context." "The community context," Martha said. "What happened here, the scope of it, the number of people affected, the particular method, it's not something we see in isolation. We've been looking at Rolston Development Group for 14 months. A different state, a similar pattern. This community is the first time we've had enough documentation from enough affected parties to build something that will actually hold." He paused. "That happened because you made phone calls," Martha said. "I made phone calls because I had help." "I know," Ames said. He looked across the room, at the tables, at the charter bus people mingling with the Silver Creek locals, at Bear Visible near the stage talking to two riders, and a woman Martha recognized as the owner of the hardware store on Main Street. "That's the community context I came to understand." Martha looked at him steadily. "Mr. Ames, the Delaney's." His expression shifted slightly. "Not evasion, something more careful than that. That case is complicated," he said. "I know it's complicated," she said. "I'm asking about it anyway." He said, if the sale was coerced through fraudulent instruments and the documentation your attorney has provided gives us significant reason to believe it was, then the transaction may be voidable. It's not a fast process, and it's not a certain one, but it is being looked at with full seriousness. I can tell you that. Tell Frank and Carolyn Delaney that, she said. They're not here today because they live in Billings, and Frank had a doctor's appointment, but they deserve to hear it from someone official. I'll reach out to them directly, Ames said. And he said it with the particular quality of a person who means because they're in the business of meaning what they say and have learned the cost of the alternative. Martha nodded once. Thank you for coming, Mr. Ames. Thank you for what you did. Mrs. Calloway, he said. She moved away from him and through the room, stopping at tables, shaking hands she knew and hands she didn't, accepting the particular kind of attention that comes from people who have read about you and feel they know something about you and want to confirm it in person. She did not love this attention. She was not a woman who had ever wanted to be a story that other people told. But she understood its purpose today, and she accepted it the way she accepted most difficult, necessary things directly, without flinching and without staying in it any longer than she had to. The auction raised $11,000 by noon. Martha was standing at the back of the room when Dennis came to find her with the number, written on a piece of paper in his block handwriting. And she looked at it and looked at him and said, "That's too much. The real tax debt is about $3,200, Dennis said, after the false fees are stripped out and confirmed by the county. Evelyn's got the revised assessment. Then we use the excess for the other families," Martha said immediately. "Ruth, the Pittmans, James Rutherford. Some of them have real debts too. Small ones, but real." Dennis looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Already suggested that to Bear. He said you'd say exactly that." "Then why did he send you to tell me the number?" Dennis smiled, a rare thing. She had learned, which made it worth more than common smiles. "Because he wanted to see how fast you'd say it." She handed him back the piece of paper and said, "Tell him he didn't need the confirmation. The preserves sold out by 1 in the afternoon. Every jar." 2 people had tried to buy multiples, and Rabbit had instituted a 2-jar per person limit on his own authority, which Martha found entirely appropriate. A woman from the charter bus found her specifically to say that she had bought the last jar and intended to use it only for special occasions, which Martha received with a complicated mixture of gratitude and mild alarm that comes from discovering that something you consider ordinary is being treated as precious by someone else. At 2 in the afternoon, Bear found her near the stage and said, quietly, "There's someone here who wants to talk to you." Outside. She followed him out the side door into the March cold, which was still cold but had in it the first thin suggestion of spring, a quality of light that February light does not have. Something in the angle of it. Leaning against the wall of the community center was a man she did not recognize. Maybe 65, weathered, with the kind of face that has been outdoors for most of its life. He was holding his hat in his hands in the way that men hold hats when they are nervous. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "My name is Ed Kowalski. My family has the property east of yours, the one that uses the spring water through the shared agreement." Martha said, "I know who you are, Ed. Your father and Walter set up that agreement together." Ed Kowalski looked at his hat. Then he looked up. "I knew something was wrong when I heard you were getting those letters. My wife told me to mind my own business. I should have called you. I knew about Ralston trying to buy properties in the valley. I heard things. I should have said something sooner, and I didn't, and I felt bad about it since the day I heard what almost happened to you." He paused. "I came today because I wanted to say that to your face, not because I thought it would make me feel better, but because you deserved to hear it from me directly." Martha looked at this man, this neighbor who had lived 12 miles from her for 30 years, whose children had gone to school with her grandchildren, whose family drank water that flowed from her back 40, and she saw in him the ordinary human thing that she had seen in various forms across all the faces of the past 3 weeks. The guilt of proximity without action. The weight of knowing you could have stepped in and didn't. The particular cost of learning too late what was happening to someone nearby. She said, "Ed, did you know about the false fee?" "No," he said. "Did you know he was targeting elderly landowners specifically?" "No," he said. "I just knew he was trying to buy. I didn't know how." "Then what you failed to do was call a neighbor," she said. "That's not a small thing, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But it's not what you're punishing yourself for." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to do something about it, help us make sure it can't happen to anyone else. That's what I'm working on now." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Whatever you need, Martha, I mean that." "I know you do," she said. "Come back inside. There's coffee, and I think there are 2 pieces of pie left." He followed her back inside, and the thing she had said to him about what she was working on now was not rhetoric or redirection. It was the most honest statement she had made all day about where her mind was living. Because the fundraiser was not the end of anything. Martha knew that with a certainty she carried in the same place. She carried the knowledge of the spring, and Walter's filing cabinet, and the green cardigan, and all the other things that were simply true about her life. The fundraiser was a resolution of one specific problem, the debt, in a way that preserved her dignity and involved her community, and did not require her to accept charity silently or gratefully or without reciprocity. It was, in its way, exactly right. But the larger work was not finished. The Attorney General's investigation was ongoing. Gary Finch had been located in Arizona, staying with a cousin, which Evelyn had described on the phone to Martha as a remarkably unambitious escape route, and had retained an attorney. The county supervisor, who had told Patricia Doyle to let the process work, had been placed on administrative leave. Ralston's development permits remained suspended, and the Delaney case was moving, slowly, and with the particular friction of legal processes that are reversing what was done rather than preventing what has not yet been done. But it was moving. These things would take months, possibly years. Martha understood that. She had not expected it to be fast, and she had not needed it to be fast, because she was not a woman who had ever confused speed with righteousness. What mattered was that it was moving. What occupied her more immediately was the workshop. It had been Bear's suggestion, but he had made it in the way of a person who is proposing something they suspect the other person has already been thinking. He had said it 3 days after the hearing, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee. his shoulder now in a proper brace, courtesy of the urgent care clinic in town that he had finally allowed Martha to drive him to. He had said, "Martha, that workshop. Walter's workshop. What are you going to do with it?" "I've been thinking about that," she said. "So have I," he said. She had been thinking about it since the night the bikers arrived. Actually, since she had stood in the blizzard and looked at the workshop and thought about what it had been, a place of work, of making, of Walter's particular brand of purposeful activity, and what it currently was, which was a cold and empty space full of good bones and waiting potential. She had been thinking about it more urgently since the night of the storm, when she had lain awake and understood that Silver Creek had no place for stranded travelers in severe weather. No shelter, no warming station, no community resource for the isolated and the caught out and the people that February blizzards create. She had thought about what might have happened to 6 men on a mountain road if the nearest farmhouse had belonged to someone else. Someone who did not open the door. She said, "I want to turn it into a shelter." Bear said, "Yes, just that. Yes." Not surprised, not building on it, not suggesting modifications. Just confirming the things she had said the way you confirm something that is already true. "Winter emergency shelter," she said. "Open to anyone who needs it. Stranded drivers, isolated elderly folks who've lost heat. Travelers, anyone. We can help build it out," Bear said. "The chapter has people. We've done community projects before. It's not a new thing for us." "I know," she said. "But I want it to be Silver Creek's project, not just the chapters. I want the town involved. The businesses, the churches, the school. I want it to belong to this community so that it survives past any one group's involvement." Bear looked at her. He said, "You've been planning this for a while." "I've been thinking about it," she said carefully. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. "Martha, that is the same thing." She let that pass. The conversion of Walter's workshop into what would eventually be called the Open Door Station took 6 weeks, with work happening on weekends and on the occasional weekday when enough volunteers could be assembled. Crews came back. For the heating system, he installed a proper unit this time, commercial grade, with a backup propane source for power outages, and he refused payment in a way that made it clear the refusal was final. Pete brought 2 other contractors from his network, and they reinforced the roof, insulated the walls to a standard that would hold in -30 weather, and installed proper electrical throughout. A plumber named Gabe, who had read Cassandra Price's ongoing coverage in the Courier and driven in from Missoula specifically because he wanted to be involved, ran hot and cold water to a proper sink and a small bathroom in the corner. The Silver Creek hardware store donated shelving. The church donated bedding, 12 sets of it, good heavy wool blankets that had been in storage, and the diner on Main Street committed to providing hot soup deliveries during any weather emergency. The school principal organized a student volunteer program for the summer months. The County Emergency Management Office, which had been following the project with interest, added the Open Door Station to the official emergency resource network for Silver Creek and 3 surrounding townships, which meant it would appear on the county's emergency communication system and that stranded motorists could be directed there by dispatch. Ruth Hensley organized the supply rotation. She showed up at Martha's door 3 weeks into the project with a spreadsheet, actual paper, printed out, because Ruth did not fully trust computers with important things, and said, "I've got a schedule for checking and restocking. I've got 8 volunteers. We rotate every 2 weeks. Nobody burns out." Martha looked at the spreadsheet. It was precise and color-coded in a way that spoke of 30 years of kindergarten classroom organization. She said, "Ruth, this is excellent." "I know it is," Ruth said, with the mild satisfaction of a woman who is good at what she does and has long since stopped apologizing for knowing it. "Now, tell me where you keep the coffee, because I've been driving for 40 minutes and I need some." The formal opening of the Open Door Station happened on a Friday evening in early May, when the last of the snow had finally released its grip on Silver Creek and the mountain road was clear all the way to the pass. Martha had not planned a ceremony. She had planned to simply open the door and let it be what it was. But Bear had pointed out, with characteristic quiet practicality, that the community needed a moment to mark the thing, not for spectacle, but for memory so that people would know it existed, would remember its purpose, would feel that they had been part of its creation. So there was a modest gathering, not the scale of the fundraiser, maybe 80 people, standing in Martha's yard in the May evening, with cups of coffee and the particular ease of people who have been through something difficult together and have come out on the other side of it, knowing each other better than they did before. The 11 families who had been targeted by Ralston were all represented. The Pittmans had brought their daughter. James Rutherford had brought his adult son, who had driven in from Spokane specifically because his father had called him, finally, and told him what had happened. And the son had cried on the phone and said, "I should have known sooner." Dad and James had said, "It's all right, son. I've got people now." Frank and Carolyn Delaney were there. They had driven up from Billings. Frank moving more slowly than he had before the stress of the past year, but present and upright and holding his wife's hand with the particular grip of a man who has come close to losing something and has not yet fully stopped being grateful that he didn't. The Delaney case was still in process. Robert Ames had been in contact with Evelyn twice in the past month, and the word he had used in the last call was progress, which Evelyn had translated for Martha as more likely than not, and Martha had told Carolyn privately that she would be on that phone with Evelyn every week until Frank's 31 years of land came back to him. Carolyn had said, "Martha, you don't have to do that." Martha had said, "I know I don't." Bear was there with most of the chapter, not all 50, because lives and distances are what they are, but 32 riders who had made the drive because the open door idea had become, in some way that defied precise description, theirs too. Something they had helped build and wanted to see standing. Bear stood at the edge of the gathering, with his shoulder fully healed now, and his jacket on, and his arms crossed in the posture of a man who is exactly where he means to be and is not in any hurry to be anywhere else. Rabbit had taken photographs throughout the 6 weeks of construction and had assembled them into something. Martha wasn't entirely sure what to call it, an account of some kind. On the internet that had been shared widely enough that Cassandra Price had written a follow-up piece specifically about the shelter project, and that piece had been picked up by a television station in Billings, which had sent a camera crew out 3 days before the opening and filmed 15 minutes of footage and broadcast 4 of them on the evening news. Martha had watched the 4 minutes, sitting at her kitchen table with Ruth, who had said when it ended, "You look very serious on television." Martha had said, "I am very serious." Ruth had said, "You could have smiled once." Martha had said, "I smiled twice." They edited them out. The ceremony, such as it was, lasted 20 minutes. Sandra Belk, the commission chair, said a few words about community accountability and the county's commitment to the homeowner review program that the hearing had established. Patricia Doyle, who had come at Martha's specific invitation, stood near the back and received a quiet round of applause when Martha mentioned her by name as the person whose 19 years of careful record-keeping had made the entire legal case possible. Patricia looked at the ground and then looked up and managed a small, real smile that Martha thought was one of the most earned smiles she had seen in a long time. Then Martha spoke. She stood at the door of the workshop, Walter's workshop, now something new, and she looked at the people in her yard and she said, "Walter built this workshop in 1979. He used it for 37 years. He fixed things in here. Not just mechanical things, he fixed whatever came through the door that needed fixing. And a lot of things came through that door over the years. Neighbors with equipment problems, friends with questions, people who just needed someone to talk to while they figured out what was broken." She paused. Walter would not have been surprised by any of this. He would have said that one open door is how everything begins. That you can't know, when you open it, what's going to come through. You just have to decide that whatever it is, you're going to deal with it. That's what this place is. It's a door that stays open. She turned and opened the door of the workshop, the open door station now, with a hand-painted sign above the door that Rabbit had made, and that was, she had to admit, better than she had expected, and she said, "Come in and have a look." People moved inside. Martha stood at the door and watched them move through what had been built, the cots along one wall. 12 of them, with the church blankets folded neat, the supply shelf with the first aid kit and the battery chargers and the emergency radio and the water jugs and the propane lanterns, the hot plate and the kettle and the tin of coffee that Ruth had placed there with the quiet authority of someone installing an essential utility. The whiteboard on the wall with the emergency contact numbers and the weather radio frequency and a list that said, in Ruth's careful printing, "If you are here and you need help, you are in the right place." Bear came to stand beside her at the door while the crowd moved inside. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the people in the space, his people and her people, which had ceased to be a distinction that meant very much over the past 3 months. And he said, "It's good, Martha." "It is," she said. "Walter would have liked it. He would have suggested improvements," she said. "He always had a better idea." "Sounds like a man worth knowing," Bear said. "He was," she said. She looked at the sign above the door, the one Rabbit had made, the open door station. "He was the best man I knew for 41 years, and I still argue with him sometimes in my head when I'm making decisions, and he usually wins." Bear said, "What does he say about all this?" She thought about it. She thought about Walter, who had filed everything and registered the spring and built the workshop and made the shared use agreement and stored 40 years of documents in a green filing cabinet because he believed in doing things right the first time. Who had brought home a hitchhiker in a rainstorm without asking first because the man was wet and had no shoes. Who had wired the yard light off the back barn so she would never have to stand in the dark alone. She said, "He says I took too long to open the door." Bear looked at her. "Did you?" "No," she said. "I opened it exactly when I was supposed to. The evening wound down the way good evenings wind down gradually, reluctantly, with people lingering past when they meant to leave, because the air in the yard had something in it that they weren't quite ready to give up. The riders were the last to go, as they always were, moving through their particular departure rituals, handshakes, the brief, hard embraces of people who show affection through contact rather than words, the ritual of putting on jackets and gloves and settling onto bikes with the practiced ease of people for whom this is simply the form of their lives. Bear was the very last. He stood beside his bike with the May evening going quiet around him and said, "We'll be back before the next storm season to check the shelter." And he paused with the ghost of something in his face that was rarer than the almost smile, something more direct. "To see you," Martha said. "You don't need a reason to come back, Bear." He looked at her. She said, "Walter's yard light is on. It stays on. That's what it's always meant." He nodded once. He put on his helmet. He started the bike, and the sound of it rolled out across the yard, and the May darkness and the mountain road beyond. And the other riders fell in around him, and they went down the driveway in a slow single column that Martha stood on the porch and watched until the last taillight disappeared around the bend in the road. The yard went quiet. Martha stood on her porch in the May night and breathed the cold, clean air and looked at the workshop, the open-door station with its lights burning through the window, and at the repaired roof of the farmhouse above her, solid and true and not leaking, and at Walter's yard light on the pole, throwing its steady circle of light across the snow-free yard. 3 months ago, she had stood in this same spot with a foreclosure notice on her kitchen table and 16 hours until noon, and a blizzard swallowing the mountain road, and she had been so alone that the aloneness had become a kind of weather condition, something she lived inside of rather than something she experienced, a climate rather than a moment. She was not inside it anymore. 11 families were keeping their land. Patricia Doyle's 19 years of copies were in the hands of the state attorney general. Gary Finch was looking at a criminal indictment. Dean Rolston's resort was on administrative hold that his attorneys were describing publicly as temporary and that Evelyn Shaw was describing privately as the beginning of the end. The county homeowner review program had already processed 43 applications in its first month, finding irregularities in 11 of them, none of which were Rolston related, all of which were being corrected, which meant the system that had been easy to abuse was being made harder to abuse. And that was not a small thing. Ruth ran the supply rotation. Bear ran the pre-storm checks on elderly residents across the valley. The diner delivered soup. The church provided blankets. The school sent volunteers in summer. The county dispatch directed stranded travelers. And Martha coordinated all of it from the kitchen table where Walter's files had once been spread out like evidence of everything that could go wrong, which they were, and which had also turned out to be evidence of everything that could be made right. She went back inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table with the cup of tea she had been meaning to make since 6 o'clock and had not gotten to. And she looked at the table, clean now, just the cup and the placemat and the salt shaker that had been in the same spot since 1981. And she thought about the year that had just passed. She thought about opening a door in a blizzard and saying, "Leave your fear on the porch." She thought about 6 men around her table, eating the last of her potatoes and bowing their heads to say grace. She thought about Bear reading the foreclosure notice with his jaw tight and his eyes moving across the numbers with the specific focus of a man who recognizes what he is looking at. She thought about 50 motorcycles on a snow-cleared road and the sound of them arriving like something the valley had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. She thought about Ruth's hands over hers at the commission table, about Frank Delaney holding his wife's hand in the Mayyard, about Patricia Doyle's small, earned smile, about Rabbit with the bandage on his arm going back to the ladder grinning, about Dennis drying her dishes with the towel from the stove handle, about Garza sweeping her kitchen floor without being asked. She thought about Walter saying, in the voice she heard now only in her own head, but heard clearly and always, "You do the paperwork right the first time. You open the door when someone needs it open. You stand still when you need to stand still, and you move when it's time to move." She thought about what it means to be a decent person, when decency costs you something. And she thought about the answer she had worked out over 73 years and a blizzard and 3 months of the hardest and fullest living she had done since the day she lost Walter, which was this: it costs exactly as much as it costs, and it is always worth it, and you know that going in, and you open the door anyway. The kettle boiled. Martha poured her tea. She sat in the warm kitchen of the house that Walter built, in the light that had not gone out, and she was not alone. 6 months later, on a Thursday evening in November, when the first real cold of the season was moving down from the mountains and the weather radio was talking about a system coming in from the northwest, Martha was in the open door station checking the supply inventory when she heard tires on the gravel outside. She went to the door. A man in his 40s, wearing a jacket that was not warm enough for the temperature, was standing in the yard looking uncertain. His truck was pulled over by the road, one tire clearly flat, and he had the look of a person who has been driving for a long time and is now in the specific situation of not knowing exactly where he is or what to do about it. He saw her in the doorway and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. I had a blowout on the road and my cell service is gone, and I didn't know if I saw the light." "Come in," Martha said, stepping back from the door. "Come in before you freeze. We have coffee and a phone and a warm place to sit, and there's a man named Cruz I can call, who will have your tire sorted out within the hour." The man looked at her. He looked at the sign above the door. He looked at the light. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't know if anyone would—" "We're always open," Martha said. "That's the whole point." She went inside to pour the coffee, and behind her the man stepped through the door into the warmth, and the sign above it caught the light, and outside the first wind of the coming storm moved through the yard and around the farmhouse and past the workshop and on down the mountain road, and Walter's yard light held steady against it, the way it had always held, the way it would go on holding, because some lights, once lit by the right hands for the right reasons, do not go out. Martha Calloway had opened one door in a blizzard, and in doing so, had opened every door that came after it, and that is how a single act of decency becomes a permanent condition of the world.